Welcome to the Tudor court, where the first thing you surrender isn't your coat, your sword, or even your dignity, it's your autonomy. The moment you stepped into Henry VIII's orbit, your personal freedom evaporated faster than his patience during a theological debate. You didn't simply serve the king, you belonged to him, the way a fork belongs to a dinner table or a boot belongs to a foot, useful, decorative, and occasionally thrown away when no longer fashionable. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. In theory, courtiers were noble, educated people with lands, incomes and reputations. In practice, they were high-status hostages wearing fancy shoes. Henry didn't want companions, he wanted satellites. You orbited him, not because gravity demanded it, but because if you drifted too far, you risked being pulled back violently. Sometimes with shackles, sometimes with a politely worded summons, which in Tudor England was somehow scarier. Every part of your daily schedule was dictated not by your own needs, but by the king's whims. You woke when he woke, or at least before him, because if Henry VIII started his day before you started yours, congratulations, you were already behind in life. You ate when he ate, you travelled when he travelled. If Henry decided, at any random hour, to go hawking, jousting, praying, touring the countryside, or simply pacing dramatically while thinking about marriage, you followed. And you did so with the elegance of someone pretending to enjoy it. One of the most suffocating aspects of belonging to Henry was that you never quite knew how much of yourself you had already forfeited. You could be halfway through a conversation, a meal, a letter home, or a sweet, innocent moment of silence when suddenly, like the world's least pleasant surprise party, a messenger arrived. His Majesty requests your presence. Those 5 words meant, your personal plans are cancelled, your opinions are irrelevant, your family may as well forget what you look like. Whatever you were doing before, it never mattered. The king requested, but everyone knew it meant, come now or start writing your will. And do not misunderstand, this wasn't simply social etiquette. This was law, reinforced by the idea that the king's body, time and will were divine instruments. If the king wanted you near, you appeared. If he wanted you far, you vanished. If he wanted your silence, you shut your mouth. If he wanted your voice, you spoke until your throat hurt. Being near Henry meant existing in a constant state of readiness, like a soldier, a servant and a nervous actor all at once. What made this rule even more complicated was that proximity equaled power, and therefore danger. The closer you stood to Henry, the more influence you had, but the more visible your every breath became. You were expected to match his energy without surpassing it, agree with him without looking desperate, and support him without appearing manipulative. You had to be present but not too present, devoted but not clingy, valuable but not threatening. It was a full-time job except with no days off, no fixed hours, and no idea when a performance review might end in beheading. Being owned by the king also extended to your behaviour beyond the court. If you left for your country estate, you could not simply enjoy the view or spend time with your sheep. No, you were expected to serve as a sort of regional spokesperson for royal ideology. Your letters, your conversations, your social gatherings, all of it was supposed to echo Henry's policies. Your identity had to align with his. Your household became a satellite court, and you were responsible for maintaining the royal echo chamber even in your absence. Your emotions, too, were technically royal property. Happiness that didn't involve the king, suspicious. Anxiety that didn't stem from the king, inappropriate. Grief, only acceptable if the king also approved the person you were grieving. The safest emotional setting was cheerful but not too cheerful, respectful but not robotic, and confident but never confident enough to make Henry question his own magnificence. It was an impossible psychological balancing act, the kind that made sleep optional and stress mandatory. Perhaps the strangest part of belonging to Henry VIII was that people wanted this. Courtiers clawed, bribed, flirted, and schemed for the privilege of losing their freedom. Why? Because Henry VIII was the sun, bright, warm, life-giving, and absolutely capable of burning you alive. Proximity promised wealth, titles, favour, land, marriages, and power, but at the same time it demanded your personhood, your privacy, and occasionally your sense of self-preservation. You didn't live for yourself at Henry's court. You lived for the king, through the king, and under the king's ever-changing expectations. Your identity became a costume you wore only when he needed it. Your loyalty was not an emotion, but a performance. And your existence became a delicate ritual of survival, a dance choreographed entirely by someone else. The good news, you were part of the most glamorous, influential court in Europe. The bad news, you were also part of Henry VIII's court, which meant your autonomy was about as real as his marital stability. If you've ever worried about making an awkward exit at a party, congratulations. You already understand Tudor court anxiety. Except in Henry VIII's world, turning the wrong way didn't just earn you a few strange looks, no, it could earn you a place on the people we no longer speak of because their head is somewhere else list. Around Henry, your back wasn't just a part of your body, it was a politically sensitive weapon that could be misinterpreted as disrespect, rebellion, or, heaven forbid, boredom. The great paradox of Henry's court was this. Everyone wanted to be near the king, yet no one dared move freely in his presence. Approaching him, standing near him, and especially leaving him were all choreographed with the precision of a royal ballet. The stakes, however, were significantly higher than in ballet. In ballet, the worst outcome is a sprained ankle. In Henry's court, the worst outcome was death, with the optional bonus feature of losing your property and your family's will to ever speak your name again. The rule was simple in theory. Never turn your back on the king. The execution was complicated, because humans are blessed with a natural instinct to pivot. The body wants to turn, the spine wants to twist, the legs want to walk forward. But at court, evolution had to take a break. Movement required strategy. You had to back away slowly, gracefully, and with facial expressions that conveyed respect instead of, "I'm trying not to trip over this rug." Courtiers spent years perfecting the backward retreat, a delicate shuffle that required talent, balance, and the ability to pretend you were not, in fact, terrified. You were expected to maintain eye contact without staring, smile without grinning, and bow without falling into a table. The entire time, your brain screamed one message. Do not fall. If you fall, you die politely, but still die. It didn't help that Henry, being a large man with an unpredictable temperament, sometimes adjusted his position while people were backing away. This meant that the respectful exit became a cross between a waltz and evading a moving bear. You had to adjust your angle without turning your back. You had to shift your steps without revealing the horror in your eyes. Court etiquette teachers would insist, your body should flow like water, but water doesn't usually fear the death penalty. There were layers of meaning behind every posture. Standing too straight suggested pride. Stooping too low suggested mockery. Standing at the wrong distance suggested over-familiarity. And standing too far away suggested distrust. You needed to master the posture known unofficially as "I'm devoted, but please don't notice me too much," which was especially tricky when Henry insisted everyone notice him constantly. Even worse, accidental disrespect was still disrespect. If your clothing snagged on a piece of furniture while you were performing your backward exit, you were in trouble. If your shoe slipped, you were in trouble. If your sword belt jingled too loudly, you were in trouble. In short, anything that reminded the king that you were a flawed human could be interpreted as an insult, and Henry already suspected most people of being insufficiently appreciative of his existence. And do not assume you were safe while standing still. In Henry's presence, standing was a full-contact mental sport. You had to angle your body in a way that signalled attentiveness without overshadowing more important courtiers. You couldn't lean, because leaning implied tiredness. You couldn't cross your arms, because that implied defiance. You couldn't fidget, because that implied nerves, and nervous people always looked guilty. Your only safe option was to stand like a very respectful statue and pray your knees didn't give out. When Henry moved, even slightly, the entire room adjusted like a flock of birds reacting to a predator. If he turned his head, all nearby courtiers subtly rotated their bodies so no one presented a back. If he shifted direction, the orbit of human planets realigned. If he decided to walk across the chamber without warning, half the court glided backward in unison, a synchronized retreat powered by fear and well-practiced leg muscles. Worst of all, Henry noticed. He noticed posture. He noticed movement. He noticed hesitation. A tiny misstep might be forgiven one day and punished the next, depending entirely on his mood, stress level, or how recently someone had annoyed him. There were men who lost royal favour simply because they tripped during a bow. There were men who lost their freedom because they walked away too briskly. Henry VIII was not the kind of king who shrugged and said, "Oh well, accidents happen." No, accidents were offensive. Mastery of body language became a specialisation. Courtiers trained themselves like dancers, spies, actors, and acrobats rolled into one. They practiced fluid backward steps in private chambers. They rehearsed bows in mirrors. They trained their wrists to gesture without appearing flamboyant. They learned how to enter a room sideways without looking like crabs. Their bodies became instruments of survival. Because around Henry VIII, your posture was political, your steps were statements, and your spine was a liability. One wrong angle and you didn't just insult the king, that you insulted the entire Tudor world order. The good news? If you survived long enough, you could perform the backward exit flawlessly. The bad news? You only learned it because the alternative was losing your head for poor choreography. If you've ever felt awkward about making eye contact with a stranger on the subway, congratulations, you have just unlocked the Tudor beginner's version of social panic. Because when it came to Henry VIII, eye contact wasn't simply a natural human interaction. It was a political act with consequences sharp enough to trim your lifespan. Looking at the king required precision, caution, and the instinctive awareness of someone defusing a bomb. Except bombs are less sensitive. At Henry's court, your gaze had a literal hierarchy. It wasn't enough to be noble, loyal, or clean. You needed the right rank to look directly at Henry for more than a heartbeat. Certain people, high-ranking nobles, ambassadors, favoured courtiers, and whatever poor soul Henry liked that week, were permitted sustained eye contact. Everyone else was granted brief, carefully timed glances, ideally no longer than the amount of time it takes to admire an expensive object without seeming as though you intend to steal it. The problem was that Henry VIII was the most observed man in England, and he knew it. Every eye in the room watched him, even when they pretended not to. His steps changed conversations. His facial expressions launched rumours. Whether he smiled, frowned, or squinted, people interpreted it as either a sign of divine favour or divine wrath. The king understood that gazes carried power, and that controlling who could use them helped maintain his dominance. So eye contact around Henry became a delicate negotiation. If you looked at him too directly, you risked appearing arrogant, as though you believed yourself capable of meeting the king as an equal. That alone was enough to shorten your life expectancy. But if your gaze darted away too quickly, it hinted at deceit, fear, or guilt, all qualities Henry associated with treason. You were expected to maintain a perfect middle ground, confident but not challenging, attentive but not intrusive, respectful but not desperate. Essentially, you had to look at Henry the way you'd look at a dangerous but beautifully dressed animal. Timing mattered. The safest moment to make eye contact was when Henry initiated it. When his eyes swept the room, because even kings like to know who's paying attention, you were supposed to acknowledge him with a polite, soft gaze that lasted just long enough to convey respect. Not admiration, not devotion, simply respect. Admiration implied flattery, devotion implied fanaticism, and fanaticism implied instability. You needed to serve dignity with your pupils and subtlety with your eyelids. When Henry spoke, eye contact rules shifted again. If he was addressing you, looking away would be considered extremely rude, unless he happened to be saying something unpleasant, in which case staring might make him think you were silently judging him. You needed to match your gaze to his tone. If he was angry, you were supposed to look appropriately troubled. If he was pleased, you could brighten slightly, but not too much, or it might seem like mockery. If he laughed, you were allowed to smile, but not before he did. Smiling before the king found something funny was like claiming to know the punchline of a divine joke, and heaven help you if Henry was in a mood. There were days when Henry felt magnanimous, and he tolerated bold eye contact from his favourites. There were other days when a 2-second glance felt like a personal attack. A courtier could be safe on Monday, and a potential traitor on Tuesday, all because their gaze lingered at the wrong moment. Henry's shifting moods created a landscape where the safest eyes were the ones that looked thoughtful but not interrogatory, calm but not sleepy, and alive but not vibrant enough to remind the king that you might have ambitions. This wasn't paranoia on Henry's part, or rather, it wasn't only paranoia. Eye contact carried symbolic weight in the Tudor world. Meeting a man's gaze suggested confidence, holding it implied authority, lowering it signalled submission or guilt. Henry understood these implications, and he manipulated them expertly. By forcing courtiers to constantly adjust their gaze according to his mood, he ensured that everyone remained off balance, dependent on his approval for even the simplest human gesture. The court noticed. People trained their eyes the way soldiers trained their weapons. Young courtiers practiced safe gazing in their chambers, observing one another and offering constructive criticism like, "Too bold, he'll think you want his throne. Too quick, he'll think you poisoned the soup. Too much blinking, he'll think you're trying to send coded signals." It was exhausting and disorienting. Imagine navigating a conversation while simultaneously calculating angles, durations, and pupil intensity. Looking at Henry demanded more focus than reading a legal document, except a legal document couldn't kill you for misinterpretation. What made these rules especially dangerous was Henry's tendency to react impulsively. He was a man who remembered every slight and forgot every context. A glance held too long might spark suspicion that you harboured ambition. A glance held too briefly might imply disinterest, an unforgivable crime in a court where the king's ego was the central gravity. Courtiers learned the harsh truth. Sometimes Henry interpreted your gaze before he interpreted your words. And that was the real terror. Words could be explained, actions could be justified, but a momentary flicker of the eyes? That was instinct. An instinct in Henry's world counted as evidence. So you learned to master the art. The respectful glance, the obedient gaze, the perfectly timed look of concern, the carefully crafted expression of admiration that implied loyalty rather than competition. You learned to let your eyes speak a very controlled language, one that promised devotion without ambition, attention without challenge, and life without risk. The good news? You could look at the king and survive. The bad news? You had to do it with the precision of someone diffusing a royal emotional landmine. In the Tudor world, physical contact wasn't just a gesture. It was a political privilege with a higher value than most noble titles. To touch Henry VIII was to enter a sacred, dangerous, and bizarrely intimate category of royal service where a person's job description included duties ranging from adjusting the king's sleeves to assisting with matters too delicate to describe without a nervous cough. And somehow this wasn't humiliating, it was prestigious. Because around Henry, the closer you got to the king's body, the closer you got to power. To understand this, you must imagine Henry VIII not as a man, but as a walking, talking, heavily jewelled embodiment of divine authority. His body was political territory, his skin was a border, his clothing was a fortress, and access to any of it required royal permission. Only a very small, elite group, the men of the Privy Chamber, and, most famously, the groom of the stool, were entrusted to touch the king. In a court overflowing with ambitious nobles, this meant that the most influential people in England were not always the ones commanding armies or negotiating treaties. Sometimes they were the ones holding Henry's towels. The groom of the stool, for instance, enjoyed direct access to Henry's most private moments, a job that by modern standards sounds like the ultimate punishment, but in Tudor society was a shortcut to power. This man saw the king unguarded, literally and politically. He helped Henry dress, bathe, and manage the bodily functions that monarchs are not depicted performing in flattering paintings. And because this role required absolute trust, the groom often became the king's confidant, a man who could influence decisions simply by being present during vulnerable moments. In a court obsessed with hierarchy, nothing said "I matter," like being allowed to hand the king his shirt. But the groom wasn't the only one whose hands became instruments of political gravity. Barbers, physicians, tailors, armourers, and valets all shared degrees of contact that would have been unthinkable for the average courtier. When Henry sat for clothing fittings, these men adjusted fabrics and fastenings around his massive, increasingly fragile frame. When he prepared for tournaments in his younger years, armourers secured his plates and buckles. When he aged and his health declined, physicians approached him cautiously. Understanding that touching the king at the wrong moment could trigger irritation, and irritation could lead to consequences, every touch was both a privilege and a test. Henry expected tenderness, respect, competence, and above all, confidence. If your hands trembled, you risked making him feel vulnerable. If you moved too slowly, you annoyed him. If you moved too quickly, you startled him. And if you made him uncomfortable, physically or emotionally, you endangered your position. Serving Henry required hands steadier than a surgeon and instincts sharper than a politician's. The political significance of touch extended beyond practical service. In ceremonies, royal touch represented healing power, divine blessing, and absolute authority. The ritual of touching for the king's evil, where monarchs placed their hands on the afflicted to cure scrofula, reinforced the idea that the king's body radiated sacred influence. While Henry eventually lost interest in this medieval tradition, the symbolism endured. The king's body was not ordinary flesh, it was a national relic. This made unauthorized contact a serious offense. Accidentally brushing the king's sleeve could be interpreted as over-familiarity. Helping him up without being asked could be seen as an insult to his strength. Even touching something he had just touched, a goblet, a glove, a dagger, carried connotations of privilege. Everyday objects became political artifacts the moment Henry's hands were on them. Courtiers prized opportunities to hand him books or receive items directly from him, not because they needed the objects, but because the exchange symbolized visibility and favor. As Henry aged and his health deteriorated, touching him became increasingly delicate. His leg ulcers, obesity, and chronic pain made physical contact potentially agonizing. Servants had to navigate this with saintly patience and tact, ensuring they didn't worsen his discomfort or remind him of it. After all, a frustrated Henry VIII could derail careers with a sentence, a gesture, or even a glare. The men closest to his body learned to anticipate his needs before he voiced them, adjusting pillows, managing clothing, lifting him in and out of chairs, and ensuring transitions never threatened his dignity. And that was the true crux of this strange rule. Touching the king was less about the contact itself, and more about protecting his dignity at all costs. Henry's image as a powerful monarch required endless physical maintenance. Even helping him move across a room became an act laden with political symbolism. If done correctly, it reinforced the magnificence of the king. If done poorly, it hinted at frailty, a dangerous suggestion in a world where monarchs were supposed to be invincible. Paradoxically, the people who spent the most time touching Henry were often the safest from accusations of treason, precisely because they knew too much. Their survival required impeccable discretion and loyalty. Reveal the king's vulnerabilities, and you betrayed not only him but the entire Tudor illusion of divine power. Keep his secret, and you became part of the inner machinery that kept the realm functioning. In the end, authority at Henry's court wasn't measured by titles or land, it was measured by inches from the royal body. Those who touched the king held a strange, intimate form of influence. Those who kept their distance remained forever on the edge of power, looking inward but never able to step close enough to matter. The good news, touching the king guaranteed visibility and influence. The bad news? It also meant your job description included, quite literally, managing royal fragility with your bare hands. If you've ever cracked a joke at work and immediately regretted it, congratulations, you already share something with Tudor courtiers. Except in a normal job, the worst consequence is an awkward silence or a meeting with HR. In Henry VIII's England, the consequence could be treason, and HR was replaced by a man holding a warrant and wondering where to put your head. Henry's court was a place where words had mass. They didn't float gently in the air, they crashed, collided, and sometimes exploded. A sentence spoken too boldly could ruin a reputation. A sentence spoken too softly could be interpreted as mutiny. And humour was the most dangerous weapon of all, because it revealed something Henry feared more than foreign armies or unhappy noblemen: people not taking him seriously. To understand this rule, you must start with the Treasons Act of 1534, a law so enthusiastic about punishing disloyalty that it included everything from plotting against the king to merely imagining his death. Yes, imagining. If you had a vivid imagination, you learned very quickly to mentally redirect it toward flowers, puppies, and harmless landscapes. Anything else risked treason by thought, an impressive legal category that made criminals of people who probably just needed a nap. Against this backdrop, jokes became loaded objects. If you made fun of the king's waistline, that was treason. If you teased his marital history, that was treason. If you joked about taxes, the weather, hunger, or anything that might indirectly imply dissatisfaction with royal decisions, well, that was treason too. Even sarcasm became a high-risk sport. If someone asked, "How is the king today?" "Yes, and you responded, "Oh, just delightful," you might be arrested on the grounds that your tone implied otherwise. Henry VIII did not enjoy ambiguity. He enjoyed obedience. The more his paranoia grew, the more sensitive he became to anything that could be interpreted or misinterpreted as ridicule. Courtiers learned to speak in a way that was both stately and sterilized, trimming sentences of anything that could resemble wit. Wordplay vanished, exaggeration evaporated, irony became a rare and endangered species. But it wasn't just jokes about Henry that were dangerous. Jokes near Henry were just as deadly. You could be discussing the price of bread with a friend when someone overheard you say, "Even the baker's running out of patience," and suddenly the rumour mill twisted it into a coded insult about royal finances. Congratulations, you have now accidentally threatened the stability of the crown because you were annoyed at breakfast. Rumours, too, were treated like active crimes. If you repeated something you heard, even with the noble intention of gossiping responsibly, you risked being accused of spreading sedition. If you listened to gossip without reporting it, you risked being accused of concealing treason. In Tudor England, the only safe approach was to pretend your ears were ornamental. Sarcasm became a particularly treacherous form of communication. Sarcasm thrives on tone, facial expression, and shared understanding. Three things Henry VIII's legal system had no patience for. If your voice dipped even slightly into "I'm joking but also not joking," or "sirke," expect a royal inquiry. Henry's court demanded sincerity the way modern gyms demand memberships, relentlessly and with hidden fees. This paranoia created a culture of linguistic survivalism. Courtiers developed elaborate strategies to avoid dangerous phrasing. They practiced delivering compliments so earnest they bordered on performance art. They replaced jokes with polite nodding. They trained themselves to laugh only when Henry laughed, and even then, only at the intensity he demonstrated. If Henry chuckled softly, you did too. If he laughed loudly, you joined him with enthusiasm. If he didn't laugh at all, you stared solemnly into the void and hoped no one questioned your emotional stability. People became so afraid of speaking freely that entire conversations turned into verbal minefields. A question as innocent as, "How are you today?" might lead to an internal crisis. If you say good, are you implying the king's policies are effective? If you say bad, are you implying the king's policies are failing? If you say fine, are you being dismissive or irritated? answer incorrectly, and you might as well start packing for the tower. This stifling atmosphere wasn't just about protecting Henry's ego, though it certainly did that. It was also a method of control. If people feared speaking, they couldn't conspire. If they feared joking, they couldn't bond over shared dissatisfaction. If they feared sarcasm, they couldn't safely mock authority. A silent court was a loyal court, or at least a quiet one, which Henry considered close enough. And yet, ironically, humour didn't disappear entirely. It simply retreated into shadows, encoded in glances, whispers, and late-night mutterings behind closed doors. The boldest courtiers dropped hints of dissatisfaction disguised as compliments so flowery they suffocated themselves. Others shared jokes in rural inns far from court, where laughter was less likely to result in decapitation. But even then the fear lingered, because in Henry's England walls had ears, neighbours had motives, and informants had absolutely no sense of humour. The good news? You were technically free to speak your mind. The bad news? Doing so was a brilliant way to lose it. In Henry VIII's England, speaking could get you killed, but so could not speaking. Silence wasn't golden. It was incriminating. And if you ever found yourself thinking, well, I'll just keep my mouth shut to stay safe, congratulations. You would have lasted about 6 minutes at court. Around Henry, mandatory enthusiasm wasn't just politeness, it was survival. The king wanted affirmation the way plants want sunlight, except if a plant doesn't get enough sunlight, it quietly wilts. Henry, on the other hand, investigated you for treason. This peculiar danger stemmed from Henry's belief that loyalty should be as audible as it was visible. If he made a decision, but any decision, and the court was expected to erupt in a chorus of support so synchronized it could qualify as a Tudor boy band. Announce a new law, applaud, change religious doctrine overnight, praise, execute someone without warning, commend to his wisdom. If Henry decided that the moon was made of cheese, the safest response was, "A delicious and profound observation, Your Majesty." Anything less suggested you were harbouring doubts. And doubts were the prequel to conspiracy, at least in Henry's mind. This created a culture where enthusiasm was no longer an emotion, it was a legal duty. Courtiers trained themselves to react instantly to royal statements, like an elite cheer squad whose school mascot was absolute monarchy. Timing mattered. Hesitate for a moment and people noticed. Hesitate for 2 moments and Henry noticed. And once Henry noticed something, nothing good followed. Imagine being in the throne room. Henry announces a policy change, perhaps something minor like rearranging the hunting schedule, or something colossal like upending centuries of religious tradition. The room murmurs with delight, heads nod vigorously, and courtiers smile with the brightness of people who value their lives. Now imagine you, caught off guard because your brain was temporarily occupied by hunger, fatigue, or wondering where your left shoe disappeared to this morning. You don't react immediately, you blink. Perhaps you tilt your head. Maybe you draw in a breath before responding. Too slow. You have now accidentally committed quiet treason. Henry believed silence was never neutral. If you disagreed with him, you would naturally hide behind silence. Therefore, silence meant disagreement. And disagreement meant subversion. And subversion meant the Tower of London, where residents famously discovered that the only thing more dangerous than opening your mouth was closing it. It didn't help that Tudor culture valued vocal displays of loyalty. Public declarations, oaths, blessings, toasts and cheers were all woven into the fabric of governance. A king didn't just want to be obeyed, he wanted to be celebrated. Henry's vision of authority required constant reinforcement, like an ego with an appetite. Every law he passed, every marriage he arranged, every religious shift he initiated, all of it required applause, the political equivalent of a like button on a platform he personally moderated with extreme prejudice. This system placed enormous pressure on courtiers, who learned to perform enthusiasm more convincingly than actors in a morality play. Smiles were polished to perfection. Compliments were crafted with poetic flair. Nods were delivered with the vigour of someone agreeing with the most reasonable idea in human history. Even the occasional gasp of admiration had to be timed with the precision of a surgeon. Because while good reactions earned security, perfect reactions earned favour. And favour in Henry's court was a shield. Even the tiniest silence could be dangerous. Consider the unfortunate souls who paused before cheering the annulment of Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon. They thought they were being respectful. Henry thought they were being defiant. Many courtiers quickly realised that the safest emotional setting was immediate loyalty, expressed loudly and repeatedly, until the king either smiled or became distracted by a tapestry. Another perilous moment was the reading of proclamations. When a herald announced Henry's decisions in public squares, the crowd was expected to respond with vocal approval. Peasants, merchants, and nobles alike learned to cheer with enthusiasm, even if they didn't fully understand what was being announced. In Tudor England, ignorance was tolerable, silence was not. Religion made the situation even more precarious. As Henry changed England's spiritual landscape, silence became a political statement whether anyone intended it or not. Failed to cheer the king's new title as Supreme Head of the Church of England? Suspicious, failed to celebrate the dissolution of monasteries? Suspicious, failed to publicly embrace each new doctrinal shift? Extremely suspicious. A pious, quiet moment of reflection could be interpreted as harbouring forbidden loyalty to Rome. Even praise had its hazards. If you cheered too softly, you seemed hesitant. If you cheered too loudly, you seemed sarcastic. If your cheering didn't match Henry's level of satisfaction, you risked implying emotional inconsistency, a trait dangerous enough to get someone exiled. Courtiers walked the razor-thin line between too much and too little, like juggling emotional knives while blindfolded. The strangest part of all this was that Henry didn't always respond to silence immediately. Sometimes he stored it away like a squirrel collecting useful grudges for winter. A courtier's quiet pause in February might resurface in June, suddenly interpreted as evidence during an unrelated political trial. Silence had a half-life. It lingered, so everyone adapted. They talked, cheered, praised, affirmed, repeated, and over-enunciated until they nearly forgot what their own natural reactions felt like. Silence, once a refuge for thought, became a criminal act. Words, once threatening because of their presence, became threatening because of their absence. The good news, you could always protect yourself by loudly approving everything Henry said. The bad news, you had to do it forever, or at least until Henry changed his mind again. In the glamorous world of Henry VIII's court, you didn't just wear clothes, you navigated them. Like stepping through a wardrobe filled not with magical creatures but with potential legal violations. Fashion wasn't an expression of personality. It wasn't even an expression of wealth. It was a visual obedience test, a daily exam graded by the king, the law, and the thousands of eyes ready to notice if your sleeves looked a little too confident for your social rank. Tudor clothing didn't simply make the man, it endangered him. Sumptuary laws controlled everything from the cut of your collar to the colour of your stockings. Their purpose was simple: ensure everyone knew their place the moment you entered a room. Henry liked a world where hierarchy was obvious, preferably so obvious that no one had to ask who mattered and they could just count the jewels. If you belonged to the nobility, congratulations. You could wear velvets, satins, furs, and the occasional precious metal without anyone suspecting you were trying to commit lifestyle fraud. But if you were lower ranked and dared to appear too extravagant, suddenly your fashion sense became a threat to the stability of the kingdom. The laws read like a tailor's worst nightmare. Only dukes could wear purple silk. Only knights could wear certain types of velvet. Only the highest-ranking nobles could wear ermine. Gold embroidery was practically a form of political messaging. Even the width of your sleeves was regulated, because heaven forbid someone appear more voluminous than their lord. When the king wanted everyone to know he was the largest presence in the room, he meant it literally. For the well-born, navigating these rules felt like solving a puzzle each morning. One wrong choice of trim and you weren't just unfashionable, you were guilty. And guilt by fashion could result in fines, confiscations, or a polite but deeply unsettling invitation to explain yourself before the King's Council. Tudor England was the only place where your tailor could accidentally ruin your whole life. Imagine waking up and thinking, I want to look nice today, then remembering, if I look too nice, I could be imprisoned. In a society where wealth was concentrated among the elite, fashion acted as visual currency. If you appeared richer than you should be, people wondered where you got your money. If you appeared poorer than you should be, people wondered where you wasted your money. The safest strategy was to look exactly as wealthy as the government believed you ought to be, a standard that changed depending on your title, your favour with the king, and occasionally Henry's mood when he glanced in your direction. The laws didn't just police fabrics, they policed colours. Purple was a royal or near-royal shade. Deep crimson was highly restricted. Certain blues and greens were tied to specific ranks. The brighter the colour, the more political it became. Wearing a forbidden hue was like walking into court carrying a sign that said, "Please investigate me." And rest assured, they would. Commoners were the most strictly controlled. They were forbidden from wearing certain ornaments, precious furs, or even specific styles associated with nobility. Even if someone had the money to dress richly, the law insisted they display their poverty honestly. A wealthy merchant could buy silk, but he couldn't legally wear it. The logic was clear. The king didn't want social climbers sneaking into grandeur through the back door. If you wanted to rise socially, you needed royal favour, not good taste. Clothing also reinforced loyalty in more subtle ways. Courtiers often wore colours that signalled affiliation with a particular faction or noble family. Supporting the wrong faction could be just as dangerous as wearing the wrong fabric. In a court where politics changed faster than fashion announcements, a poorly timed outfit could suggest allegiance to someone Henry suddenly disliked. More than one courtier learnt the hard way that clothing wasn't simply decorative, it was incriminating. And then there were displays of royal privilege. Henry himself wore garments so extravagant they bordered on myth. Gold-threaded robes, jewel-encrusted doublets, furs imported from frighteningly distant places. His outfits didn't just display wealth, they displayed dominance. No one could outshine the king. It was a political impossibility and a treasonous fashion statement. Your wardrobe had to flatter him, not overshadow him. A particularly flashy doublet might cause Henry to raise an eyebrow, and if Henry raised an eyebrow, everyone else raised concerns. For women, the laws were equally complex. Queens and noble ladies dressed in layers of luxury, their gowns heavy enough to serve as personal fortresses. Lower-ranked women, however, had to remain visually obedient. A lady-in-waiting who dressed too boldly could be accused of trying to elevate herself above her station, or worse, of trying to attract the king's attention. In Henry's court, being noticed by the king could be either a promotion or a catastrophe. Dressing safely became a literal survival tactic. Tailors, meanwhile, lived their own brand of misery. One slip of the shears, one misjudgment in fabric choice, and suddenly they were accessories to a fashion crime. Many tailors kept detailed records not of their craft, but of the legal permissions of every client. Some even refused to make certain garments unless the wearer produced proof of rank, a medieval version of "show me your ID." The strangest part of this entire system was that it worked. People learned to read clothing like political tarot cards. They could tell who was rising, who was falling, who had money, who had favour, and who was one poorly chosen outfit away from financial ruin or social disgrace. Clothing wasn't just clothing, it was a public declaration of where you belonged. The good news, you always knew exactly who outranked you by looking at their sleeves. The bad news, if your sleeves were too fancy, you suddenly outranked yourself straight into legal trouble. At Henry VIII's court, eating was not the simple act of placing food into your mouth. Oh no, that would be far too easy, far too human, far too dangerously natural. Instead, meals served a far more thrilling purpose, allowing courtiers to demonstrate obedience, etiquette, hierarchy, and spiritual devotion, all while pretending not to notice the king chewing in the corner like a divine spectacle. The Tudor dinner table wasn't a place to eat. It was a place to perform, with an audience of everyone you hoped would not ruin your life. To begin with, you never just sat down and ate. You arrived with the posture of a saint, the expression of a scholar, and the self-control of someone trying desperately not to stare at the 50 different kinds of meat laid out in front of you. Meals happened in elaborate stages, each choreographed to display order and magnificence. The grand hall filled with music, murmured conversation, and occasional whispers of "do not touch that yet unless you want to vanish mysteriously." The king's seating position alone could inspire its own lecture series. Henry sat elevated on a dais, not merely so everyone could see him, but so no one could avoid seeing him. Whether he was eating, speaking, or simply existing, the entire room flowed around his presence like human satellites orbiting a hungry sun. The king's plate, goblet, and even crumbs were symbolic, reminders that while you were dining, you were also participating in a ritual reenactment of your inferiority. The first rule of dining at court was timing. Food appeared in courses that followed a schedule only Henry fully understood. Dishes were placed before him with reverence, then presented to the nobles, then trickled down to everyone else like a delicious, meat-filled demonstration of class hierarchy. You did not begin eating until the king did. If he paused, you paused. If he gazed thoughtfully at a roasted swan, everyone gazed thoughtfully at their own plates. If he suddenly decided he didn't like a particular dish, nobody else liked it either, regardless of how desperately hungry they were. Then came the ritual of presentation. Food wasn't simply served, it was displayed like edible artwork designed to impress and intimidate. Peacocks arrived with their feathers reattached. Boars' heads stared across tables with glazed eyes. Pastries were shaped into castles, animals, and occasionally scenes of moral instruction. Each dish carried political significance. A pie shaped like a fortress might hint at national strength. A roast stag might symbolize noble privilege. A particularly large platter of beef might symbolize Henry's optimism about marriage number whatever he was on. Eating these creations required caution. You could not lean. You could not slurp, you could not chew with enthusiasm, even your choice of utensil mattered. While Henry embraced the use of forks later in life, many traditionalists at court viewed them with suspicion, as though using metal prongs to lift food was an act of moral weakness. The safe solution was to watch others mimic their movements and pray you didn't accidentally stab yourself or, worse, draw the king's attention. Conversation during meals followed strict guidelines. You were expected to talk, but not too loudly. Laugh, but only politely. Express interest, but not too much interest, lest you appear more captivated by conversation than by the royal presence. You could not bring up politics unless Henry did first. You could not discuss illness, war, famine, or, amusingly, digestion. Meals were supposed to be uplifting affairs full of noble topics like poetry, philosophy, and flattering commentary on whatever Henry happened to be eating. The king himself was watched constantly, and every gesture he made was interpreted like a message from the heavens. If he took a second helping, people buzzed about royal appetite. If he put down his fork, the room grew still. If he sneezed, half the courtiers wondered if it was a sign of approaching death and whether they should dramatically panic or remain admirably calm. Being too calm, of course, might suggest indifference, which was dangerous. Panic was also dangerous. The only safe emotional category was mildly alert. Drinking added another layer of complexity. Wine, ale, and other beverages were consumed according to rank. Goblets differed not only in size but in decoration, ensuring everyone remembered their place even while hydrating. Toasts were ceremonial moments requiring perfect execution. Raise your cup too slowly and you seemed unwilling. Raise it too quickly and you seemed over-eager. Spill anything and you might end up with a reputation that followed you for years, or days if Henry was feeling particularly poetic about your mistake. Servants, meanwhile, served more than food. They served as silent commentators on your etiquette. They observed who grabbed too eagerly, who chewed too dramatically, who whispered too much. Their reports could reach important ears. In a setting where misbehaviour could be interpreted as disrespect, servants became accidental auditors of noble conduct. A single misplaced napkin fold could appear in a rumour faster than the king could devour a second leg of mutton. But perhaps the hardest part was pretending that all of this was normal. Meals lasted hours. People sat upright with aching backs, forcing smiles, nodding thoughtfully, and eating cautiously. You couldn't show hunger. Hunger was vulgar. Hunger suggested you were not the picture of abundance a noble should be. So you nibbled politely, ignoring the fact that half the food on the table was purely theatrical and not meant to be eaten by anyone except the king and the lucky few whose social rank qualified them for edible privilege. And finally there was the end of the meal, a moment many courtiers cherish the way prisoners cherish sunlight. But even leaving the table required ceremony. You did not rise until Henry did. You did not leave until he signalled the end. If the king remained seated long after everyone else had finished, you sat too, desperately willing your legs not to fall asleep while maintaining an expression of serene enjoyment. In the end, the Tudor dining experience wasn't about nourishment. It was about order, perception, and performance. You weren't eating food. Food was eating you, consuming your time, posture, nerves, and any hope you had for a peaceful evening. The good news, you got to witness some of the most spectacular meals in Europe. The bad news, you weren't so much dining as auditioning for survival. In most households, when someone is unwell, friends and family offer sympathy, broth, blankets, and perhaps a gentle reminder not to sneeze directly onto the furniture. But in Henry VIII's England, acknowledging the king's illness was roughly equivalent to announcing a comet had just struck the palace. You didn't simply avoid discussing Henry's health, though you denied that he had a body capable of malfunction at all. To suggest otherwise was not merely impolite, it was treasonously pessimistic. This rule didn't become truly perilous until Henry began suffering from chronic ailments. In his youth, he was a physically dazzling monarch, athletic, broad-shouldered, enthusiastic about sports, and painfully proud of his vigour. But as he aged, the picture changed. Leg ulcers tormented him, his mobility deteriorated. He gained weight so dramatically that had scales existed capable of measuring him, they would have considered resigning. Yet despite this, the official narrative insisted that Henry VIII was the pinnacle of radiant health, second only to the archangels. The mythology around the king's body was not decorative, it was political. Monarchs were supposed to embody strength, stability, and divine favour. A weak king meant a weak kingdom, and a weak kingdom invited foreign enemies, domestic unrest, and, worst of all, people with ambitions. Therefore, acknowledging Henry's ailments was considered destabilising, as though saying, "The king has a sore leg," might instantly summon France. So everyone played along. When Henry limped, courtiers described it as a dignified adjustment of stride. When he groaned in pain, they insisted it was a thoughtful exhale. When he struggled to mount a horse, they praised the noble patience of a monarch surveying his steed. And when he clearly could not wear armour anymore, they pretended the king was simply choosing to honour the virtues of delegation. You were required to see a man in physical decline and declare him magnificent, to observe his discomfort and call it majestic stillness. It was less long live the king, and more long live whichever version of the king makes him least angry today. Physicians became actors in this royal drama. Their job was not to tell Henry what was wrong with him. Their job was to tell Henry in elaborate medical poetry that he was unquestionably healthy while subtly treating his symptoms on the side. They used terms like noble swelling, kingly heaviness, and the humour's gentle insistence. Elaborate phrases meant to disguise the reality of infected leg ulcers large enough to terrify seasoned soldiers. Being a doctor for Henry required 2 degrees, one in medicine and one in creative writing. Even the royal wardrobe participated in this cover-up. Tailors were commanded to adjust garments so cleverly that no one would notice Henry's changing shape or restricted movements. Layers of fabric, panels of reinforcement, and discreet openings all helped maintain the illusion that Henry looked exactly as he had in his athletic youth. In this sense, the king's clothing functioned as a kind of royal theatre curtain, concealing, smoothing and flattering while no one dared peek behind it. Courtiers, meanwhile, developed a special skill set, the ability to observe nothing. If Henry winced, they looked reverently at the ceiling. If he leaned heavily on a cane, they smiled and praised his regal stride. If he smelled strongly of medicinal ointments, they commented on the refreshing aroma of royal vitality. They perfected faces of polite admiration so blandly cheerful that it was difficult to tell whether they were looking at their king or a decorative tapestry. This act of constant denial served another political function. It kept courtiers from appearing opportunistic. Nothing was more dangerous than seeming interested in the king's health, because interest implied speculation, and speculation implied anticipation, and anticipation implied that you were calculating the king's death. Even the vaguest hint that you were thinking about succession could land you in the tower with astonishing speed. Thus, you could not ask, "How is the king feeling?" You could not whisper, "His Majesty seems tired today." You could not even look concerned unless Henry himself authorized concern, which he never did. Your official emotional position was, "The king is in perfect health at all times." Any claims to the contrary are French lies. Foreign ambassadors, however, delighted in reporting on Henry's condition. They observed his stiffness, his swelling, his weight, his reliance on attendants, but they shared these observations in secret letters home, never allowed within earshot of the Tudor court. Even they understood that Henry's body was less a body and more a state secret covered in jewels. What made this rule especially surreal was that Henry himself knew he was unwell. He felt the pain, he experienced the limitations, he suffered the infections, and yet he demanded that everyone treat him as the same radiant force he had once been. His pride demanded it, his ego required it, and his paranoia enforced it. To acknowledge his frailty was to threaten the carefully crafted illusion that the king was more than a man, he was the engine of the nation. And so the lie endured. Courtiers watched him wince and pretended they saw confidence. They watched him struggle and pretended they saw contemplation. They watched him deteriorate and pretended they saw triumph. It was the quietest, strangest collective agreement in Tudor England. Reality is optional. The king's invincibility is not. The good news, you never had to worry about insulting the king's health, because officially he didn't have any. The bad news, denying reality in Henry's court was mandatory and exhausting. In most places, laughter is simple. You hear something funny, your brain lights up and noise comes out of your face. Not so in Henry VIII's court, where laughter required strategy, calibration, and a sense of danger usually reserved for tightrope walkers. Here, humour was political terrain, and the wrong chuckle at the wrong moment could turn your future into a cautionary tale whispered nervously by other courtiers. Comedy wasn't a pastime, it was a survival skill with a learning curve. To start with, humour at court revolved entirely around the king's emotional climate. Henry VIII was not merely the audience, he was the director, performer, critic, and, if necessary, executioner. If he made a joke, people laughed. If he hinted at a joke, people laughed. If he accidentally said something that could maybe, with effort, be interpreted as humorous, people laughed. But if Henry was serious and you laughed, then you were laughing at the king. And if you were laughing at the king, it meant you didn't fear him. And if you didn't fear him, the logical conclusion, in Henry's mind, was that you were plotting treason. So everyone became a master of tonal interpretation. When Henry smiled, you gauged the curvature of his lips. Was it amusement? Was it superiority? Was it indigestion? You waited a fraction of a second to see how his favourites reacted. If they chuckled, you chuckled. If they didn't, you smiled faintly as though appreciating the philosophical depth of his silence. Timing was everything. 1 second too early and you seemed overeager. 1 second too late and you seemed unsure. And uncertainty in Henry's world was basically a confession. The king loved to surround himself with entertainers, fools, jesters and musicians, people whose job was to create laughter on command, but even they were careful. A jester's livelihood depended on knowing exactly when humour lifted the king's spirits, and when it might get them tossed into the nearest moat. Court jesters were, in many ways, the bravest people in the palace. Their job required noticing the king's mood before he noticed it himself. They needed instincts sharper than swords. Courtiers, meanwhile, were expected to laugh with the king, never at him, and certainly never before him. If Henry made a joke, your laugh had to match his energy level. If he chuckled gently, you chuckled gently. If he erupted into booming laughter, you unleashed your most impressive laugh without overshadowing him. Overshadowing the king was dangerous in every category: physical, political, emotional, and comedic. If you laughed louder than Henry, it suggested your joy was greater than his, which was unacceptable. The king's happiness was supposed to be the loudest in the room. On the other hand, failing to laugh enthusiastically enough was equally dangerous. If Henry told a joke that fell flat and you reacted cautiously, he might interpret your hesitation as criticism, or worse, as judgment. Henry VIII did not enjoy being judged. Jesters who misjudged the moment might find themselves abruptly unemployed, and courtiers who misjudged it might find themselves abruptly arrested. The king also enjoyed telling long, winding stories that he believed were riveting. Many were not, but your attention was mandatory. You listened with an expression of polite delight, nodding at key moments, smiling when appropriate, and gasping softly if the anecdote demanded it. When Henry inserted humour, accidental or deliberate, your reaction needed to signal that you had just witnessed the apex of Tudor comedy. But humour wasn't just about pleasing the king. It was also about navigating the complex web of relationships around him. If a favoured courtier made a joke and Henry laughed, you laughed too. If a non-favoured courtier made the same joke, you waited to see Henry's reaction. If he smiled, you joined in. If he frowned, you rearranged your face into solemn disapproval. If he looked confused, you adopted an expression that implied the joke was beneath your intellectual dignity. In essence, you became a living mirror for Henry's emotional state. The inverse situation was even trickier. Henry laughed, but the joke wasn't funny. Truly, sincerely not funny. Perhaps it was a pun so weak it could barely walk, or a bawdy remark that wandered off halfway through. But none of that mattered. You laughed anyway, because the humour wasn't in the content, it was in the context. The king had laughed, therefore laughter was correct, and if laughter was correct, failing to laugh was incorrect. And incorrectness was treason adjacent. One particularly treacherous area was laughter at other people. Henry sometimes enjoyed teasing his courtiers. If he mocked someone, you needed to join in, but not too enthusiastically. Laughing too hard at the king's jabs made you look cruel. Laughing too softly made you look sympathetic toward the victim. Sympathy in Henry's court was suspicious. The safest approach was to laugh politely, as though the insult were not devastating but mildly whimsical. Naturally, there were scenes in which laughter was absolutely forbidden. If Henry was angry, grieving, brooding, or contemplating something solemn, laughter could ruin your life. A snicker during a tense council meeting was practically signing your own execution warrant. Even a cough that vaguely resembled a chuckle might be investigated. The safest emotional posture in these scenarios was profound seriousness, preferably accompanied by a furrowed brow that implied you cared deeply about the kingdom's stability. The fascinating thing about all of this is that Henry himself understood the power of laughter. He used it to punish, reward, distract, manipulate, and humiliate. He used humour to create intimacy with favourites and to distance himself from those he wished to intimidate. He weaponized jokes. In his hands, laughter became political theatre, a signal, a threat, a test, and occasionally a trap, and courtiers played their roles dutifully, knowing that the price of misinterpreting a punchline might be far more than embarrassment. It might be land forfeiture, it might be exile, it might be the tower. Suddenly the stakes of comedy became very real. The good news? You never had to wonder whether the king found his own jokes funny. He would make that clear. The bad news? You had to adjust your laughter to match his, like a human mood ring with perfect comedic timing. In most lives, marriage is a personal affair. Two people, a hopeful future, a celebration involving food of questionable quality, and relatives who comment too boldly on your choices. But in Henry VIII's court, marriage was not a private decision. It was a royal event, whether the king was involved or not. If you wanted to marry, Henry wanted to know. If you wanted to love, Henry wanted to approve. And if you wanted to make the mistake of marrying without royal permission, well, you'd better enjoy the ceremony, because your honeymoon destination could easily become the Tower of London. To understand why marriage required such scrutiny, you have to see it through Henry's political eyes. In the Tudor world, marriage wasn't about affection, at least not primarily. It was about alliances, inheritances, property transfers, bloodlines, and who controlled which corner of the playing field. A wedding among nobles wasn't two households joining, it was two political factions merging. And the one person who never wanted to be surprised by merged factions was the king. Courtiers learned quickly that their hearts were not sovereign. They belonged to Henry in the same way their time, loyalty, and clothing choices belonged to Henry. If you fell in love, wonderful, but first you must ensure your romantic aspirations didn't threaten the delicate political geometry surrounding the king. A marriage between two influential families might create a power block too large for Henry's liking. A marriage between a rising courtier and someone already favoured might produce a rival network. Even marriages between minor nobles could cause ripples if their combined estates grew inconveniently large. So before you dared to whisper the word engagement, you needed to prepare a dossier that explained why your union posed no threat whatsoever to the stability of England or to Henry's digestion. You presented your case with the humility of someone confessing a minor crime. Your Majesty, I have found someone I admire. Not too much, of course. Respectfully, politically harmlessly, in the most unthreatening manner possible. Approval wasn't guaranteed. Henry might say yes, he might say no, he might say yes, then change his mind again, depending on who whispered in his ear during dinner. He might decide that your marriage would disrupt the balance of the court. Or he might simply be in a mood where the concept of love irritated him, and once Henry said no, the conversation was over, unless you enjoyed experimenting with new forms of peril. Romantic secrecy became a pastime of desperate lovers. Courtiers snuck glances, traded letters, arranged meetings behind tapestries, and whispered hurried conversations during dances, but secrecy itself was a risk. If Henry discovered that two people had formed an attachment without his knowledge, he interpreted it as a deliberate political maneuver. Secret romance became synonymous with secret plotting, and Henry VIII believed any secret not told to him personally was probably treason. The consequences of defying this rule were not theoretical. One of the most famous cautionary tales was that of Lady Margaret Shelton, rumoured lover of the king, and several attendants who fell under suspicion for inappropriate attachments. Court ladies were expected to embody chastity, unless the king took an interest, in which case chastity became optional. Men hoping to marry these women needed royal consent largely because, in Henry's mind, a woman at court was too politically valuable to belong to anyone else without his express permission. It wasn't only love matches that fell under scrutiny. Widows were watched just as closely. A rich widow was the Tudor equivalent of prime real estate, desirable, strategic, and guaranteed to attract attention. If a courtier married a wealthy widow without approval, Henry saw it as an unsanctioned consolidation of land. He hated unsanctioned consolidation of anything. Even after receiving permission, couples were not free from scrutiny. Their behaviour became part of court entertainment. Were they too affectionate? Suspicious? Too distant? Also suspicious. Did their marriage produce heirs immediately? If yes, political implications. If no, questions about alliances and succession. Tudor gossip did not limit itself to who was courting whom. It followed couples into their marriages like a nosy aunt with a magnifying glass. For women, the constraints were especially sharp. Lady-in-waiting's marriage prospects were often delayed for years because Henry or the Queen valued her service. Falling in love became inconvenient if you were assigned to hold royal gloves or accompany the Queen on walks. A lady might wait a decade for approval, only to discover the king suddenly wanted her to marry someone else, and someone politically convenient but personally underwhelming. Marriage proposals were, in effect, royal matchmaking exercises disguised as affectionless paperwork. And yet the facade of romance persisted. Courtiers wrote poetry, exchanged tokens, and professed devotion. They simply understood that the greatest seduction wasn't a whispered vow, it was a well-crafted argument about why their relationship wouldn't threaten national security. The most horrifying truth was this: even Henry's own marriages influenced whether others could marry. When he was happy, approvals flowed. When he was unhappy, everyone else's love life froze. Courtiers began predicting royal moods as though checking the weather. Rain expected, void proposing. Cloudy with a chance of annulment, postpone elopement. Sunshine and royal affection, safe to request permission. In the end, marriage at Henry's court was not the joining of two souls, it was the joining of two political variables, which the king alone was allowed to solve. Love required approval, engagement required approval, happiness required approval. The good news? You were free to fall in love. The bad news? Your love life needed to pass a royal inspection, and Henry VIII was not known for gentle grading. In most stable kingdoms, the law is a solid piece of architecture, a well-built structure you can lean on without worrying it will collapse and crush you. In Henry VIII's England, the law was more like a tent in a windstorm, technically present but always shifting, bending, and occasionally flying into the sky because the king woke up annoyed. Under Henry, the legal system wasn't a system at all, it was his personality wearing a robe. This was a monarch who believed his emotions were divine indicators of justice. If he felt angry, someone must be guilty. If he felt cheerful, someone could be forgiven. If he felt insecure, someone needed to be investigated. The law didn't simply follow Henry, it mirrored him. And mirroring Henry was a dangerous job because the man had the emotional stability of a thunderstorm trying to sort out its identity. Courtiers quickly realized that the king's mood was the most important legal text in the realm. People read his face the way modern analysts read financial charts. A furrowed brow, troubling legal times ahead, a tight-lipped frown, unfavorable policies incoming, a bright smile, brief window of mercy, use wisely. One could say Henry legislated with his eyebrows and sentenced with his sighs. It didn't help that Henry VIII possessed a rare combination of qualities: absolute power, chronic insecurity, and a tendency to take everything personally. The result was a legal culture where crimes didn't need definitions, only feelings. If Henry felt betrayed, the accused was a traitor. If Henry felt mocked, the accused was a slanderer. If Henry felt someone thought too highly of themselves, the accused was guilty of overstepping. And if Henry felt absolutely nothing at all, well, that was unusual, and therefore suspicious. Under this volatile system, treason became the catch-all solution for any emotional discomfort the king experienced. The Treasons Act of 1534 was written broadly enough to interpret nearly anything as disloyalty. But interpretation was the real instrument of power, and interpretation depended entirely on the king's mood. A comment made yesterday that seemed harmless could suddenly become treacherous today because Henry had indigestion. Legal consistency didn't exist. Henry's irritations became policies, and his happiness became temporary ceasefires. A man could be in favour on Monday, questioned on Tuesday, arrested on Wednesday, and executed by the following week, all without any change in his behaviour. What changed was the king's perception, and perception was the only evidence required. Courtiers learned to fear small triggers, a misinterpreted gesture, a poorly timed compliment, a moment of hesitation, a sigh in the wrong direction. Because in Henry's world, these weren't social missteps, they were potential legal violations. The council, for its part, developed an impressive and terrifying talent for retroactive justification. If Henry suddenly disliked someone, laws could be rewritten or reinterpreted to prove that the king's feelings were actually profound insights into national security. The legal process became a performance where lawyers, scribes, and nobles worked backward from Henry's emotion of the day to produce a corresponding legal conclusion. It was the world's most dangerous version of show your work. Consider some of Henry's most infamous decisions. When he fell in love with Anne Boleyn, he reshaped the entire religious structure of England to annul his marriage to Catherine. When Anne failed to produce a son, he suddenly discovered that she was a treasonous seductress. When his friendship with Thomas More soured politically, More's refusal to verbally support Henry became a criminal offence. In every case, Henry's emotions weren't reactions to policy, they were the policy. Even Parliament wasn't immune. Though it held theoretical legislative power, its members often acted as emotional translators for the king. If Henry entered the hall looking stern, Parliament braced itself for a session filled with rapid-fire legal innovations driven by royal irritation. If he entered smiling, members dared to hope their workload might remain manageable. Essentially, they weren't lawmakers, they were mood interpreters. One of the strangest aspects of this system was that no one felt safe, not even the king's closest companions. The Privy Council lived in a state of constant vigilance, monitoring Henry's tone, pacing, appetite, and breathing patterns for signs that justice was about to shapeshift again. A cheerful king meant prosperity. A brooding king meant updated wills and goodbyes whispered into goblets of wine. Even foreign ambassadors learned to navigate Henry's moods with diplomatic gymnastics. They reported not just political developments, but emotional weather forecasts. His Majesty appeared content, though his leg pains him, caution advised, or the king was restless today, proceed gently. Nations adjusted negotiations based on whether Henry seemed pleased with breakfast. The most heartbreaking part was that the common people weren't spared either. Royal moods affected taxes, land seizures, military campaigns, and religious expectations. A single bad day for Henry could lead to sweeping changes that reshaped the daily lives of millions. One morning's irritation might mean a monastery's dissolution. One afternoon's melancholy might mean a noble family's downfall. England lived not under the stability of law, but under the volatility of one man's bloodstream. Ultimately, Henry VIII reinvented justice not as a system, but as a temperament. It fluctuated, contradicted itself, and demanded constant attention. Courtiers didn't study statutes, they studied the king. They didn't fear committing crimes, they feared committing inconveniences. Henry's emotions, anxieties, ambitions, and impulses became the most powerful legal force in the land. The good news: if the king liked you, you enjoyed a golden age of prosperity. The bad news: Henry VIII rarely liked anyone for long. In most eras, religious identity evolves slowly, over decades, centuries, or at the pace of a very determined snail. Under Henry VIII, however, religion evolved at the speed of royal irritation. A single day could transform the nation's doctrine, your personal beliefs, and the legal definition of heresy. Faith wasn't a matter of conviction anymore. It was a matter of compliance. And compliance meant keeping up with the king's latest revelation, reform, or theological whim before someone decided your soul and your head were overdue for relocation. Before Henry's reign, England's religious structure was stable, familiar, and very Roman Catholic. But then came Henry's desire for an annulment, which the Pope inconveniently refused. This refusal became the spark that ignited a national identity crisis. Overnight, and then repeatedly after that, Henry decreed that England's spiritual foundation was whatever he needed it to be at that exact moment. If consistency is the backbone of religion, Henry snapped that backbone like a twig. The first major shift came with the Act of Supremacy in 1534, which announced, with the confidence of a man discovering a new hobby, that Henry VIII was now the supreme head of the Church of England. This was not a gentle introduction, but a dramatic declaration that God himself had updated the organisational chart. Every subject was now required to embrace this divine administrative restructure. If you hesitated, congratulations, you're a heretic. If you disagreed, you were a traitor. And if you openly opposed it, you were soon to be a historical footnote with missing body parts. The terrifying part wasn't just the idea of a religious overhaul. It was that anyone could be punished for failing to adopt the newest version of the faith, even if they didn't yet know it existed. Imagine waking up Catholic, attending a Mass that was legal on Tuesday, and discovering by Wednesday morning that the same Mass was now adjacent. People walked around with the exhausted expressions of students who'd been told the final exam material had changed again. The dissolution of the monasteries became the next theological earthquake. Henry dissolved hundreds of monasteries, abbeys, convents, and friaries, seizing their wealth and property. Monks and nuns who had lived peacefully for decades suddenly found themselves evicted by royal decree. Yesterday they served God. Today they served confusion and unemployment. Many vowed poverty, but not the kind that included being kicked out with nothing but a robe and a prayer. This wasn't simply logistical chaos. It was spiritual whiplash. Long-held traditions disappeared. Sacred relics were dismissed as frauds. Holy shrines were torn down. And if you had dared to venerate a relic before Henry banned it, that was perfectly fine. If you venerated the same relic after Henry banned it, you had revealed yourself as an enthusiastic criminal. Perhaps the most dizzying element of Henry's religious reforms was their constant back and forth. Henry never fully embraced Protestantism, though he weaponized Protestant ideas when they were politically convenient. He maintained many Catholic rituals while simultaneously severing ties with the Catholic Church. His beliefs, in short, were a theological buffet, a little doctrine here, a little doctrine there, arranged according to royal appetite rather than sacred tradition. This meant that nobody truly knew what the king believed, except that whatever he believed must be correct, and whatever he believed yesterday might require polite revision today. Preachers scrambled to adjust sermons, scribes edited religious texts, ordinary citizens tried not to say the wrong prayer in front of the wrong person. People learned to express faith with guarded neutrality, enough devotion to seem sincere, but not enough specificity to get them arrested. The danger extended beyond worship. Even conversations about religion became perilous. Asking a friend what they thought of the king's changes might be interpreted as fishing for treason. Not asking might suggest apathy. Expressing excitement made you seem reformist. Expressing caution made you seem loyal to Rome. Expressing confusion was perhaps the most dangerous of all, because confusion implied you were not keeping up, and failing to keep up with Henry's spiritual sprints was legally hazardous. Families were divided. Neighbours reported each other. Parish priests struggled to keep up with edicts that seemed to multiply faster than they could copy them. And the stakes were high. Execution for heresy was not reserved for radicals. It could happen to anyone caught praying incorrectly, speaking incautiously, or adjusting too slowly to the king's evolving definition of piety. Clergy suffered most. One month a priest might be praised for upholding traditional Catholic practices. The next month those same practices became evidence of subversion. Some priests switched sides so quickly their sermons resembled weather reports. Today's forecast is moderate reform with a chance of sudden scripture realignment. Even Bible translation became a political act. Sometimes English translations were encouraged. Sometimes they were condemned. Sometimes they were celebrated as tools of national enlightenment. Other times they were treated as dangerous deviations. Henry liked the Bible, but only when he controlled it, much like everything else. Foreign powers watched this religious turbulence with fascination and alarm. Ambassadors wrote confused letters home describing a kingdom where doctrine seemed to obey royal moods rather than divine authority. France and the Holy Roman Empire wondered if England had invented a new kind of faith, one that could be rewritten overnight and still expected absolute obedience. Amid all this, ordinary English citizens clung to survival. They attended whatever church service was currently legal. They learned new prayers at extraordinary speed. They hid old devotional items in cupboards. They practiced the fine art of theological neutrality, hoping that if God was merciful and Henry was distracted, they might live through the decade without accidentally committing a crime of faith. The good news, you could adapt to the king's new religion simply by agreeing with him. The bad news. Henry VIII's beliefs changed faster than most people changed their socks. In a world obsessed with appearances, where smiles were rehearsed and conversations tiptoed through minefields of royal sensitivity, writing should have offered relief. A place to breathe, a place to think, a place to put down what you could never safely say aloud. But in Henry VIII's England, writing was not an escape, it was a trap. Ink did not dry. It waited for a reader, for a spy, for a trial, for the day when your perfectly innocent sentence could be interpreted, reinterpreted, or helpfully rephrased into treason. The danger began with the simple fact that Henry's government was deeply suspicious of private thoughts. Spoken words were dangerous enough, but at least speech vanished into the air. Writing, however, lingered. It could travel. It could be copied. It could be delivered to the wrong hands. A letter might reach a friend, or it might reach Cromwell, which was the Renaissance equivalent of your diary accidentally emailing itself to the Department of Justice. And because writing preserved ideas, it also preserved evidence. A poorly chosen metaphor, a stray complaint, a sarcastic joke, or even a harmless observation about politics could be extracted from its context and pinned to you like a moral crime. Ink made your thoughts immovable, undeniable, and prosecutable, truly a terrible combination. As a result, writing became one of the most nerve-wracking activities at court. Every letter required the emotional energy of a confession and the paranoia of someone composing a farewell note to sanity. You didn't simply ask your sister about her health. You asked about it in a way that implied unwavering allegiance to the king. You didn't complain about the weather. Someone might decide that storm clouds gather was a coded reference to rebellion. Even discussing dinner could be risky, because if Henry was dieting and you mentioned feasting, someone might interpret it as criticism of royal discipline. It was not unusual for courtiers to write drafts of drafts, revising and removing anything that looked remotely suspicious. A sentence like, "I hope things improve soon," risked sounding like commentary on the state of the realm. A harmless complaint like, "My neighbours are troublesome," might be twisted into an accusation that rich families were conspiring. People learned to write the most bland, emotionless letters imaginable, draining their correspondence of personality until it resembled a collection of polite sighs on parchment. And the real terror? Your writing didn't even have to be discovered during your lifetime to destroy you. Letters could resurface years later, pulled from boxes, trunks, or forgotten corners of estates. A harmless note written during a peaceful moment could suddenly be used as evidence during a political storm. Ink never aged out of danger. Spies, informants, and opportunists eagerly participated in this literary surveillance. A servant delivering a letter might accidentally read it. A rival might intercept it. A court official might seize it as part of an investigation. Even family members could betray you, whether intentionally or by mishandling a letter so catastrophically that the ink barely had time to dry before it landed on a royal desk. It wasn't just formal letters that posed a threat. Notes, scribbles, and drafts carried equal risk. A frustrated thought written in haste could become a legal disaster. A casual remark in your journal could be interpreted as sedition. People learned to burn their drafts, bury their rough notes, or, safest of all, avoid writing altogether. Many courtiers developed the habit of composing ideas entirely in their heads, editing internally and speaking only when absolutely necessary. It was safer to forget a thought than to record it. Even poetry, that beloved weapon of Renaissance creativity, became hazardous. Love poems could imply forbidden romance. Satire could imply political subversion. Religious reflection could imply alignment with the wrong doctrine. A poem intended to impress a friend could instead impress the executioner, with its usefulness as evidence. One of the most chilling realities was that intent didn't matter. You could insist you meant nothing by a phrase, or that a line was metaphorical, or that a reference was purely poetic, but none of that mattered once the wrong eyes had decided your meaning. In Henry's England, meaning was not decided by the writer. Meaning was assigned by whoever held the power to ruin your life. Because of this, people adopted new habits of writing so vague and careful that their letters resembled riddles. Courtiers used flowery, inflated language to bury any remotely sensitive idea beneath layers of politeness. A simple message like, "I disagree" became, "I await with humility further enlightenment on the matter," trusting wholly in the wisdom guiding us. Clear messages were dangerous. Ambiguity was the only shield left. Foreign correspondence brought its own terrors. Writing to ambassadors or relatives abroad required triple caution. Henry's government frequently intercepted outgoing letters, scanning them for hidden agendas. Writing anything resembling criticism of English policies, even accidentally, turned you into a potential conspirator with foreign powers. One unfortunate phrase could be twisted into a diplomatic scandal. Royal messengers, too, served as agents of fear. They were entrusted to carry letters, but they also observed who wrote the most, who wrote too little, who wrote too often, and who wrote with suspicious privacy. A sealed letter was not a guarantee of secrecy, it was an invitation to curiosity. By the height of Henry's paranoia, the safest written communication was one that never existed at all. People turned to oral messages, coded gestures, and careful small talk. Trust evaporated. Paper became an enemy. Ink became the silent witness that could testify against you. In Henry VIII's England, literacy was no blessing. It was liability. The more articulate you were, the more likely you were to incriminate yourself, because clever people wrote clever things, and clever things were dangerously open to interpretation. The good news, no one expected you to write beautiful letters anymore. The bad news, they did expect you not to accidentally write yourself into an execution. In most societies, having friends improves your life. They help you laugh, share meals, offer support, and occasionally stop you from doing something stupid. But in Henry VIII's England, friendship served a very different function. It increased your chances of being arrested. Under Henry, your social circle wasn't just a group of acquaintances. It was a rolling, unpredictable archive of potential evidence. Anyone you talked to, wrote to, sat beside, or even smiled at too warmly could end up dragging you into the nearest courtroom, willingly or not. This danger came from a simple truth. Henry VIII believed conspiracies were everywhere. If someone fell from favour, the king didn't see it as an isolated incident. He saw it as a network, a web, a cluster of traitors pretending to be polite. And once the king decided a person was guilty, the next logical step was to examine their friends, family, servants, tutors, hunting companions, drinking partners, chess opponents, and anyone else who once borrowed a quill from them. The entire group became suspicious by association. This system meant that you could be entirely loyal to the king and still be arrested simply because someone you knew behaved unwisely. Even casual acquaintances weren't safe. If a man sat beside you at dinner and later said something treasonous, investigators might decide that you shared his opinions. If a distant cousin wrote you a letter expressing mild frustration about taxes, you were suddenly implicated in fiscal heresy. If a friend servant overheard you laughing at the wrong moment, the servant could report it, dragging both of you into a legal maze you never meant to enter. Friendship suddenly became a liability, not because you distrusted your friends, but because the king distrusted your friends. And if he distrusted your friends, he distrusted you for trusting them. Under Henry, loyalty wasn't an individual trait. It was a contagious state of being. An exposure to the wrong person could infect you with suspicion. This paranoia intensified whenever the court experienced a political shake-up, and the court experienced political shake-ups with the enthusiasm of a kitchen constantly renovating itself. A favoured minister fell, his colleagues became suspects, a noblewoman offended someone influential, her household was reviewed, a court faction lost momentum, its members became walking question marks. People learned to quietly distance themselves from anyone showing signs of royal disfavour, the Tudor version of stepping away from someone who has just loudly declared they dislike the host's cooking. One of the most chilling examples of guilt by association was the fall of Anne Boleyn. When she was accused of adultery and treason, several men who had merely been friendly, courteous, or geographically near her were swept up in the charges. Some of them barely knew her. Others simply exchanged pleasantries. All of them died. That event burned into the court's memory as a clear warning. Friendliness itself could be fatal. The effect was immediate. People began managing their social interactions with the precision of skilled diplomats. You didn't just choose friends, you curated them. A potential companion wasn't evaluated on their charm or kindness, but on their political temperature. Were they rising, safe enough to greet warmly? Were they falling? Time to practice emotional detachment. Were they unpredictable? Avoid eye contact and hope they didn't sit next to you at the banquet. Every conversation became a calculated risk. If someone approached you privately, you wondered, why me? Why now? Who will see us talking? Will I regret this by sunrise? Even harmless chit-chat carried weight. You didn't casually complain, you didn't discuss policy, you definitely didn't share personal frustrations. If someone else did, you laughed awkwardly, changed the subject, and imagined your soul filing an official complaint against them. Servants too became part of this social danger. They overheard everything. They reported things. Some did it for reward, others for survival, and some simply because they had learned the unpleasant truth. Silence was more dangerous than speaking. If a servant heard something suspicious and didn't report it, they risked punishment. If they reported something that wasn't actually treasonous, well, the authorities would sort that out. With axes. Letters posed an even greater threat. Correspondence could be intercepted, misread, or used as evidence of communication with known traitors. A simple note asking a friend to visit could be interpreted as plotting. A thank you letter could be reframed as a coded message. Even lending books to the wrong person could be construed as intellectual conspiracy. In Henry's England, you didn't share reading material unless you were willing to share legal risk. This constant fear reshaped the way friendships worked. People became transactional. Connections shifted based on survival, not affection. You might spend years cultivating a friendship only to abandon it in an instant because the king frowned at your friend during Mass. Cowardly? Sure. Practical? Absolutely. No one wanted to become evidence simply because they were too loyal to someone who no longer enjoyed royal favour. But the most tragic victims of this system were those who believed in genuine loyalty, who clung to their friends even as political tides turned. Their devotion, admirable in spirit, became a death sentence in practice. Standing by a disgraced friend looked noble in theory, but in Henry VIII's England, nobility of heart had the life expectancy of an ice cube in candlelight. In the end, courtly friendships became a strange paradox, essential for advancement, but dangerous for survival. You needed allies to navigate politics, yet those allies might one day turn into liabilities. You needed confidants, yet confiding in anyone was reckless. You needed supporters, yet supporting the wrong person at the wrong time was a crime. The good news? You were never lonely. The court was full of people watching your every move. The bad news? Most of them were watching to see if you would become their next piece of evidence. In most civil societies, executions are solemn, sombre, moral, deep breaths, grim reminders of law and consequence. In Henry VIII's England, they were performances, equal parts morality play and political theatre, where your emotional reaction was not only observed, but judged. The king didn't simply want justice carried out. He wanted justice applauded, properly, audibly, and with no hint that you were questioning his decision, even internally. Under Henry, the scaffold wasn't just a stage for the condemned, it was a test for the audience. An execution announcement spread through the court like wildfire, not because people anticipated spectacle, though Tudor crowds were disturbingly enthusiastic about decapitation logistics, but because everyone instantly worried about what their reaction should be. Should they look relieved, determined, passionate, appropriately horrified, appropriately thrilled? There was no handbook, just the knowledge that the wrong expression at the wrong time, directed at the wrong person, could get you a front row seat at next month's execution from the other side of the performance. Courtiers understood this immediately. Your face was part of the punishment. When Henry condemned someone to die, he wasn't just eliminating an enemy. He was surveying the court to identify lingering sympathies, invisible alliances, or anyone foolish enough to look melancholy at the wrong moment. If Henry disliked the condemned, you needed to dislike them too. If Henry looked contemplative, you adopted an expression of serious approval. If Henry was angry, you mirrored righteous fury so convincingly that passing theologians might ask you for tips. Enthusiasm had to be visible but not flamboyant. Excessive excitement suggested you enjoyed executions a little too much, which raised questions about your stability. Too little excitement suggested you were mourning the condemned, which raised far more dangerous questions. Even the act of attending public executions had political meaning. Absence was suspicious. Were you avoiding the event because you secretly sympathised with the condemned? Because you feared you'd be forced to reveal emotions? Because you didn't want to participate in the king's demonstration of power? Attendance was mandatory in spirit, even when not explicitly required. And once you were there, you entered a world where survival meant emotional choreography. You had to match the crowd's energy without looking like a mindless follower. You had to cheer at the right moments, not gleefully, but with dignified approval, as if you recognised the moral necessity of the execution and deeply appreciated Henry's unwavering commitment to keeping England safe from dangerous individuals, such as scholars who disagreed with him or wives who annoyed him. But cheering wasn't the only expectation. You were also expected to display appropriate relief, especially if the condemned had been someone influential. Relief showed that the kingdom was safer now that this troublesome person was gone. Relief suggested gratitude toward the king for handling the situation. Relief executed correctly was the emotional equivalent of bowing with your eyebrows. The crowd wasn't left to improvise. Everyone understood that royal officers watched audience reactions with hawk-like precision. If someone looked pale with sorrow, they were questioned. If someone whispered to their neighbour, they were questioned. If someone's cheer sounded weak, muted, or delayed, they were questioned. These questions were rarely friendly. More often, they were the first step in determining whether you had committed treason by sympathy, a crime invented by Henry's insecurity and perfected through practice. Executions also served as powerful propaganda. Henry wanted the realm to see that disloyalty ended decisively. The entire ritual was designed to demonstrate strength, restore order, and remind subjects that rebellion was not worth the trouble of cleaning bloodstains off one's shoes. But propaganda only worked if the audience participated convincingly. That meant cheering at the right time, gasping at the right time, and generally behaving like a unified choir of national loyalty. This emotional obedience extended beyond the scaffold. After the execution, you had to talk about it correctly. At court, conversations were monitored informally through gossip and formally through informants. If someone said, "It's tragic, really," they risked sounding sympathetic. If they said, "The king was right," but their tone lacked fervour, they risked sounding disloyal. The safest phrase was something like, "It was necessary," delivered in a tone of grave civic duty, as though you personally had overseen the moral bookkeeping of the kingdom. Even funeral practices became political. If the condemned were denied proper burial ceremonies, expressing sadness or criticism was dangerous. If the condemned were granted burial rites, praising their virtues was still dangerous, because praising someone executed for treason placed you on the border of treason yourself. The only safe way to speak of the dead was to say very little, very neutrally, very slowly. Servants, too, understood these rules. They learned not to display grief even if they had seared the condemned for years. They learned to keep their voices steady and their interactions brief. Many whispered prayers only at night, in private, and even then worried that God might misunderstand their intent and accidentally send a rumour floating toward the palace. Executions of highly placed individuals were especially perilous. When a queen or noble fell, the political landscape reshaped itself instantly. You had to adjust your loyalties, language, and emotional posture before breakfast. If you cried over a fallen queen, the king saw it as betrayal. If you celebrated too eagerly, you risked looking opportunistic. Navigating these moments required emotional flexibility worthy of a contortionist. The most horrific part of this entire system was that no one ever felt safe. Even Henry's favourites knew that one day they might be on the scaffold receiving the same carefully calibrated applause they once gave others. And so everyone clapped carefully, smiled carefully, gasped carefully. Mourning was rehearsed, celebration was restrained. Every emotion became a calculated pose. In the end, executions were not just about the condemned, they were about the living. They taught subjects that survival required more than obedience. It required public agreement, visible loyalty, and careful applause. The good news? You always knew exactly where you stood with the king, at least when someone else was on the scaffold. The bad news? One misplaced expression, and you could become the next event people were forced to cheer for. At first glance, Henry VIII's court looked like a place you'd never want to leave. There were feasts, dancers, musicians, hunting parties, glittering tapestries, and enough embroidered clothing to blind a small village. But beneath all the noise and splendour was a truth every courtier learned quickly and painfully. You could check in any time you liked, but actually leaving required a bureaucratic miracle. The court wasn't just a workplace, it wasn't just a social hub, it was a gilded cage, and the key to its door sat squarely in Henry's very unpredictable hands. The Tudor court moved constantly, following the king from palace to palace like a particularly anxious flock of birds. But whether it was Greenwich, Hampton Court, Windsor, or whatever residence Henry felt like invading with his entourage of hundreds, the rule was always the same. No one left without explicit royal permission. Not a weekend trip, not a quiet visit home, not even a short hop to check on your lands unless the king approved it. This wasn't because Henry wanted company, though he certainly enjoyed a large audience. It was because he wanted control. A courtier outside his reach might form alliances, share information, or make decisions without him. And Henry despised being left out of anything, especially things involving power, gossip, land, or affection. So he implemented a system that transformed travel into a political procedure worthy of a small embassy. Imagine requesting leave from court. You approach a higher-ranking official to inquire whether it might please His Majesty if you briefly return to your estate to ensure the tenants haven't eaten one another. That official then speaks to another official, who mentions it to a secretary, who whispers it to someone near the privy chamber, who maybe eventually brings the matter to the king. And Henry, depending on his mood, might reply with, "Yes, no. Who is that again? Not now. Why? Tell him to stay. Well, on exceptionally dangerous days, we will consider it," which meant never ask again. Even if Henry granted permission, you often received a time limit so specific that even the sun itself would struggle to obey it. Return by the Thursday after Michaelmas unless summoned sooner meant your life now revolved around a mystical combination of church calendars, royal whims, and weather patterns. For courtiers, this created a psychological environment resembling polite imprisonment. They lived surrounded by wealth but lacked the fundamental freedom of movement. A courtier might spend months, even years, away from their home estates, relying entirely on agents, servants, and rumour to know whether their finances were thriving or burning to the ground. The irony was painful. Many noblemen owned thousands of acres, but could barely walk off palace property without filing royal paperwork. The rule wasn't just about geography, it was about loyalty monitoring. If you wanted to leave court, Henry wondered why. Were you bored? Boredom suggested ingratitude. Were you homesick? Homesickness suggested emotional ties stronger than devotion to him. Were you ill? Illness suggested weakness, which he did not like to see. Were you trying to avoid something? If so, what? His imagination began to fill in the blanks, and Henry's imagination was notoriously bloodthirsty. Worst of all, departing court made you less visible, and in Henry's England, invisibility was political suicide. If the king stopped seeing your face, he slowly forgot you existed. And if he forgot you existed, he certainly forgot your loyalty, your service, and any reason not to suspect you of treason. Many courtiers stayed at court simply because leaving, even with permission, made them vulnerable to accusations raised in their absence. And it wasn't only the king you had to fear. Your enemies, and everyone had enemies at court, took note when you requested leave. If they saw opportunity, they whispered that you wanted to flee before being accused of something. If they didn't like you, they suggested you were corresponding with foreign powers or hiding secret documents at your estate. If they really disliked you, they implied your sudden desire to travel was evidence of guilt. Even your luggage could betray you. Pack too lightly and it looked suspicious, as though you planned to flee. Pack too heavily and it looked suspicious, as though you intended to hide something important. This atmosphere turned travel into theatre. Before leaving, you held lengthy farewells. You expressed gratitude for the privilege of stepping outside the palace walls. You assured everyone you would return promptly. You said goodbye to the king in a way that suggested you cherished every moment spent in his presence and looked forward to cherishing more soon. In short, you performed loyalty with your entire face. Once outside the palace, your movements were hardly freer. Henry employed messengers, informants, and local officials to observe courtiers in the provinces. If you attended the wrong feast, visited the wrong acquaintance, or even spent too much time alone, someone might report it just in case. You were expected to conduct yourself as though the king stood 3 feet behind you at all times. And if anything happened at court while you were gone, a scandal, an arrest, a shift in favour, your absence became suspicious by default. People whispered, "He left just before things went wrong. How convenient." Or worse, perhaps he knew something. Returning to court was its own ordeal. You re-entered the palace with the energy of a student returning from a suspiciously long bathroom break during an exam. You smiled too much or too little. You reassured everyone that your loyalty had remained as firm as ever, even while visiting your estate or recovering from illness. You acted grateful just to be back inside the political volcano, because the truth was simple. Court wasn't a place you stayed because you wanted to. It was a place you stayed because leaving was more dangerous. The good news, you could technically travel if you really needed to. The bad news, you needed 6 approvals, a spotless reputation, a defensible reason, and a king who happened to be in the mood for generosity. If you've ever agonized over buying a holiday present for a difficult relative, multiply that anxiety by 1,000, add the threat of beheading, and you have the Tudor experience of giving a gift to Henry VIII. Gift-giving at his court wasn't a charming cultural tradition. It was a high-stakes diplomatic exercise disguised in ribbons and polite smiles. The right gift could elevate you, the wrong gift could bury you. And the terrifying part was that the difference between right and wrong changed depending on Henry's mood, appetite, injuries, marital status, insecurities, and the last time someone else angered him. Ifs were expected on special occasions, New Year's Day being the most important, though not the only one. Birthdays, feast days, weddings, treaties, recoveries, victories, and moments Henry simply felt particularly kingly all required presence. The court prepared for these events with more strategic planning than a military campaign. Workshops worked overtime. Jewelers crafted pieces that glimmered with political intent. Tailors designed garments flattering enough to please but modest enough not to challenge Henry's own royal glamour. Meanwhile, courtiers paced their chambers, rehearsing how they would present their offerings without looking frightened, desperate, or suspiciously enthusiastic. The problem was simple. Henry VIII was a difficult man to shop for. If your gift was too cheap or ordinary, he felt insulted. If your gift was too expensive, he felt threatened. If your gift was practical, he felt bored. If your gift was overly flattering, he felt mocked. If your gift resembled something another courtier had given, he felt overlooked. In short, choosing a present for Henry required prophetic insight combined with deep emotional endurance. Courtiers studied Henry's tastes obsessively. If he enjoyed hunting that month, gifts involving falcons, hounds, saddles, or hunting attire were safe choices. But if Henry had recently been injured while hunting, which happened often, then those same gifts became reminders of mortality, aging, and frustration, and therefore dangerous. If Henry enjoyed music, instruments, and compositions were excellent choices, unless, of course, someone else gave a better one, in which case your gift appeared mediocre at best. If Henry developed an interest in fine fabrics or jewels, those were reliable until he suddenly lost interest. at which point your expensive textile transformed into evidence that you were out of step with the monarch's evolving personality. The safest gifts were personalised ones: portraits, custom books, elaborate embroidery, mechanical marvels, carved miniatures, and anything that showcased devotion without ostentation. But even these had risks. A portrait that flattered Henry too subtly suggested you lacked enthusiasm, too boldly, and you were implying he didn't already look like that. A book dedicated to him could be interpreted as sycophantic unless the content was politically relevant, spiritually invigorating, or entertaining in exactly the right way. Then came the ritual of presentation, which was almost as risky as the gift itself. You could not simply hand the king an item and hope for the best. You had to introduce it with elegant respect, briefly explain its significance, and then demonstrate your gratitude for the privilege of allowing the king to accept it. Your expression had to be deferential, but not grovelling, proud, but not confident, hopeful, but not calculating. You essentially had to look like a well-trained Labrador offering a jewel-encrusted stick. Henry's reactions were studied by the entire court. If he smiled, your year brightened instantly. If he frowned, you updated your will. Even a neutral expression became nerve-wracking because Henry rarely remained neutral about anything unless planning something quietly destructive. Courtiers developed an advanced ability to interpret micro-expressions, treating every twitch of the king's lips as though it was scripture. And of course, their gift-giving wasn't simply about pleasing Henry. It was also about outgifting your rivals. Courtiers weren't competing for affection, they were competing for survival. If your enemy delivered a magnificent silver goblet adorned with gemstones, while you presented a small but tasteful embroidered handkerchief, you essentially announced that your ambitions were small, your loyalty was unimpressive, and your bank account was embarrassing. On the other hand, if you attempted to match your rival's extravagance and your gift outshone theirs, Henry might interpret your generosity as an attempt to appear wealthier, more noble, or more important than he permitted. The truly skilled courtiers understood the art of calibrated generosity, giving just enough to show devotion, but not enough to frighten the king. This delicate balance was harder than trimming an onion with a broadsword. It required reading Henry's ambitions, insecurities, triumphs, and frustrations, and then selecting a gift that soothed or bolstered him in the moment. A gift to encourage but never overshadow. A gift to please but never challenge. A gift to flatter but never embarrass. Henry's wives faced their own version of the gift dilemma. Queens offered the king exquisite clothing, symbolic rings, and commissioned works of art. Their gifts had to affirm affection without appearing manipulative, a nearly impossible task in a marriage where affection itself was sometimes a political performance. A queen who misjudged her gift risked looking disloyal. A queen who excelled too much risked looking cunning. Meanwhile, gifts flowed not only upward but downward. Henry bestowed gifts on courtiers, nobles, ambassadors, and allies, and these gifts communicated far more than generosity. Receiving a royal gift meant you were noticed, temporarily secure, and perhaps due for advancement. Not receiving one meant you were forgettable at best, doomed at worst. Declining a royal gift, unthinkable. Accepting it too enthusiastically, also unwise. Everything rested on moderation, which was ironic given moderation was not one of Henry VIII's strengths. The most tragic victims of this culture were the genuinely warm-hearted, those who gave gifts with sincerity rather than strategy. Their earnestness, while admirable, made them vulnerable. In a court where every gesture had political meaning, sincerity was either misinterpreted or exploited. A gift freely given could easily be reframed as ambition. A heartfelt offering could be twisted into flattery. Generosity became dangerous unless wielded with precision. In the end, gift-giving at Henry's court wasn't about generosity at all. It was about signalling. Your gift said, "I understand my place." It said, "I honour you." It said, "I have no dangerous ambitions." It said, "Please remember me favourably." And most importantly, it said, "I would very much prefer to keep my head attached to my body." The good news, giving the perfect gift could earn Henry's admiration. The bad news: one wrong gift, and you became the cautionary tale future courtiers studied with trembling hands. If you thought Henry VIII's court was stressful on a normal day, with shifting rules, delicate etiquette, and the constant fear of disappointing a man who treated moods like weapons, imagine what happened when a foreign ambassador walked through the door. Instantly, the entire court underwent a transformation so dramatic it could have been mistaken for a religious conversion. Everything changed. Your posture, your vocabulary, your face, your ambitions, your political stance, and even the way you held a spoon. Diplomacy didn't just influence the court, it rewrote it. Foreign visitors were not merely guests, they were witnesses. Eyes from France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, Venice and beyond. Eyes that would return home and report what they saw. And Henry VIII cared deeply, almost obsessively, about how England appeared to outsiders. If an ambassador thought the king seemed weak, Henry grew furious. If an ambassador thought the king seemed poor, Henry built a palace. If an ambassador thought the king seemed paranoid, well, Henry normally handled that by becoming even more paranoid. Thus, when foreign dignitaries arrived, the court entered a state of high alert. Every greeting became a performance. Every gesture became symbolic. Courtiers felt as though their bodies had suddenly been drafted into service as props in a diplomatic theatre production. One of the first rules was simple: never embarrass the king. But the definition of embarrass was so broad it included nearly anything. Walking too fast, walking too slow, bowing incorrectly, mispronouncing a foreign name, appearing too friendly with the ambassador, appearing not friendly enough, wearing something unimpressive, wearing something too impressive, laughing too loudly, laughing too softly, or existing in a way that Henry found even slightly inconvenient. Courtiers had to transform instantly into polished diplomatic ornaments. In front of visiting nobles, you conducted yourself with flawless elegance, as though the court had always been a serene, orderly place full of charm and enlightenment, and not a barely controlled emotional experiment run by a man who changed wives the way others changed hats. Even conversations with foreign visitors were perilous. Everything you said had to support the image Henry wanted to project that week, which could be: England is powerful, England is wealthy, England is spiritually enlightened, England is preparing for war, England is absolutely not preparing for war, England is happily unified under Henry's perfect leadership, thank you very much. If an ambassador asked about the king's policies, your answer needed to be vague enough to avoid political traps, but enthusiastic enough to avoid seeming ignorant. If an ambassador praised the king, you praised him louder. If he criticised something subtly, you pretended you didn't hear it. If he criticised something less subtly, you panicked quietly. The danger wasn't limited to what you said, it extended to how you behaved. Ambassadors watched everything: how the king treated you, how you treated the king, how you treated each other. If the court appeared divided or uneasy, ambassadors reported weakness. If the court appeared too unified, they suspected propaganda. Every diplomatic visit became a tightrope walk between looking too comfortable and looking too anxious, while genuinely being extremely anxious. Henry himself often changed personality in the presence of foreign guests. If he wanted to impress France, he emphasised his wealth, athleticism, cultural sophistication, and his idea of high fashion, which usually included wearing enough jewels to sink a fishing boat. If he wanted to intimidate the Holy Roman Empire, he leaned into displays of military readiness and personal authority. If he wanted to charm Venice, he showcased wit, scholarship, and elaborate pageantry. Courtiers had to adjust instantly, like emotional chameleons mirroring the king's diplomatic aspirations. To support Henry's shifting presentations, the court altered its entire routine. Suddenly there were additional feasts, elaborate ceremonies, dramatic banquets, carefully staged debates, and expensive entertainments designed to demonstrate England's grandeur. You might spend half a year eating politely to avoid criticism, only to spend the next week eating elaborately to impress foreigners. Music became louder, colours became brighter, curtains were replaced, horses were polished, The entire kingdom spruced itself up like a man preparing for a blind date with Europe. And then there were gifts for ambassadors. Not personal gifts, though those existed, but gifts on display. Furniture, art, architecture, tapestries, royal attire, even the palace kitchens. Everything became symbolic. Showing too much luxury might alarm diplomatic partners into thinking England was preparing for war. Showing too little luxury might suggest weakness or poverty. So the court aimed for strategic opulence, enough to inspire awe, but not enough to cause panic. It was political Goldilocks economics. Ambassadors, for their part, weren't passive observers. They were trained to look for cracks. Was a courtier sweating because the room was warm, or because he feared political instability? Was a hesitation in dialogue due to shyness, or was it evidence of factional tension? They interpreted everything with the intensity of professional gossip analysts. This meant courtiers had to censor emotions twice as hard. If you disliked a foreign visitor, you smiled anyway. If you admired one too much, you hid it, unless Henry wanted you to admire them. If you felt exhausted, you pretended you didn't. If you felt confused, you absolutely pretended you didn't. Confusion was political quicksand. Even seating arrangements became political puzzles. Courtiers agonized over being placed too close to a foreign visitor, which implied dangerous intimacy, or too far away, which implied suspicion. Being placed next to an ambassador could be a sign of trust or a setup for disaster. Being introduced to an ambassador could make your career or ruin it. Every introduction was a gamble. Every handshake was a calculated risk. And yet, this performative diplomacy had an absurdly ironic twist. The ambassadors were doing the exact same thing. They too were pretending. They too were carefully selecting words, gestures, and expressions. They too were terrified of misrepresenting their own kings. Diplomatic meetings were essentially two groups of people lying politely to avoid war. Still, for Henry's courtiers, the stakes were higher. An ambassador who made a mistake returned home with a diplomatic apology. A courtier who made a mistake returned home in a wooden box, or didn't return home at all. In the end, foreign visitors didn't merely observe the Tudor court, they transformed it. They forced courtiers to become actors in a grand performance where the script changed daily, and the audience held international consequences. When ambassadors arrived, your personality wasn't your own. It was Henry's. Your words weren't your own. They were England's, and your future wasn't your own. It depended entirely on whether your diplomatic smile convinced everyone that the king's world was perfect, stable, and absolutely not collapsing internally. The good news? Hosting foreign visitors made the court feel glamorous. The bad news? You had to survive diplomacy, which meant surviving Henry's expectations while being watched by half of Europe. In most societies, history is something that happens, is written down, and then remains largely consistent unless a historian decides to argue about it in a book centuries later. In Henry VIII's England, history was something that could be rewritten mid-conversation, retrofitted on the fly, reshaped to suit the king's needs, and expected to be instantly believed by everyone who valued their continued existence. The past wasn't a distant country, it was a workshop, and Henry was its chief carpenter, busily sawing off inconvenient branches and hammering new ones into place. It wasn't enough to remember what happened. You had to remember it the way Henry remembered it, even when Henry's memory contradicted itself. Especially when Henry's memory contradicted itself. Under this volatile system, the only stable historical truth was that truth was unstable. Consider Henry's marriages, real-time demonstrations of historical flexibility. 1 month Catherine of Aragon was his lawful wife, beloved and divinely sanctioned. The next month she had never really been his wife at all. He declared their marriage invalid retroactively, which reshaped not only the present but the past itself. Suddenly, courtiers needed to remember that they had never truly congratulated the couple, never truly celebrated anniversaries, and never truly considered Catherine the Queen. Any lingering memory of those events was now politically suspicious, evidence of attachment to an obsolete past. Anne Boleyn received the same treatment, but faster. During their courtship, Anne was the radiant hope of England. the woman who would give Henry the son destiny demanded. She was praised in poetry, honoured in ceremonies, and held up as a symbol of renewal. But once she fell from favour, history altered instantly. She had always been a dangerous seductress, always a political threat, always morally questionable. Courtiers had to adjust their memories with dizzying speed, editing out compliments they once offered and replacing them with retroactive mistrust. This forced historical amnesia wasn't optional, it was a performance expected of everyone. When Henry declared a new truth, your job was to behave as though it had always been the truth. If he said a treaty had been misunderstood, you nodded and assured him you'd suspected as much. If he decided a former ally was now a long-standing enemy, you agreed that the signs had been clear. If he announced that an old policy had been misinterpreted, you praised his insight and pretended you'd privately questioned the policy yourself. This phenomenon extended far beyond marriage. Henry's interpretation of political events, religious developments, foreign relations, and personal rivalries all required constant historical recalibration. A noble who was loyal yesterday could become a traitor today, and a traitor today could transform into a misunderstood patriot by next week. The court maintained a collective flexibility of memory that would make modern psychologists weep. The most dangerous aspect of this system was that you needed to update your understanding instantly. Being slow to adopt the new version of history was a sign of disloyalty. If Henry announced that someone had betrayed him months ago, you needed to remember signs of betrayal immediately, even if you had spent those months sharing wine with the accused and praising their virtues. Expressions like, "I had no idea," could sound dangerously close to "I wasn't paying attention." And in Henry's England, inattentiveness could be interpreted as sympathising with the enemy. And heaven forbid the king changed his mind again. Some historical revisions had multiple drafts. When Thomas Cromwell rose to power, history was rewritten to portray him as a brilliant asset, the architect of modern England. But when he fell, history snapped its fingers and declared that he had been an opportunist all along, scheming for personal gain. Courtiers didn't just accept this revision, they insisted it matched their long-standing private impressions. Cromwell's enemies boasted that they had always been suspicious. His friends swore they had always distrusted him. And after his execution, the king occasionally said positive things again, at which point everyone adjusted their memories once more. Keeping up with these shifts required enormous emotional stamina. You were expected to erase attachments, opinions, and even personal experiences if they no longer matched the king's preferred narrative. It was like living in a kingdom where the official motto was, "We've always believed whatever we currently believe." Servants and lower-ranking courtiers had the hardest time. They didn't have access to the high-speed gossip networks that circulated new historical interpretations within the upper echelons. If word reached them late, they could easily be caught making a comment based on last week's truth. A catastrophic slip. One poorly timed sentence could sabotage a reputation permanently. In this world, the past could betray you without warning. Foreign ambassadors struggled to keep up as well. They often reported baffling contradictions, agreements annulled retroactively, alliances redefined, royal statements reversed. Their letters home sometimes read like dispatches from a realm where reality was suggested rather than confirmed. And yet, even they learned quickly. Arguing with Henry about his own history was like trying to debate thunder. The rewriting of history also allowed Henry to justify nearly any decision. If he wanted to annul a marriage, subdue a noble faction, or restructure religious doctrine, he simply altered the narrative around the event. Facts became clay, memory became a puppet, and everyone else became supporting actors in the king's personal revisionist chronicle. The psychological impact of this system was immense. You couldn't trust your memory because your memories could incriminate you. You couldn't trust your past alliances because past alliances could be reframed as conspiracies. You couldn't trust your emotional attachments because attachments to people erased from history became evidence of treason. Living through Henry's reign meant living in a perpetual state of uncertainty about what you had seen, felt, or believed. By the end of his rule, courtiers had become experts in selective memory, masters of retroactive loyalty, performers of historical flexibility. They didn't just survive change, they anticipated it, adjusting their recollections like dancers shifting steps the instant the music changed. The good news? Agreeing with history was easy. You simply repeated whatever the king said had happened. The bad news? By the time you finished adjusting, history had usually changed again. In most lives, grief is private. You cry, you withdraw, you cling to loved ones, you collapse into a chair with the emotional weight of a small cathedral pressing on your ribs. But in Henry VIII's England, your grief wasn't yours. It belonged to the king, to the court, to the political balance of the moment, and to the whispering spectators who evaluated your sadness like officials checking grain quality. Mourning wasn't an expression of humanity. It was a public performance shaped by rules, rituals, and suspicion. Even sorrow required strategy. The Tudor court lived in a constant state of emotional surveillance. Joy had to be appropriate. Anger had to be hidden. Humour had to please the king, but grief? Grief was the most dangerous of all because it revealed loyalties. Who you cried for said who you cared for, and caring for the wrong person, especially someone who fell from favour, was a crime in slow motion. If a friend, spouse, or relative died, your emotions didn't dictate your response. The king did. Henry VIII viewed mourning through a political lens. Too much sorrow implied dangerous attachment. Too little sorrow implied suspicious independence. The ideal mourner was a person whose grief expressed itself in precisely measured, government-approved quantities. Take the death of a disgraced courtier. Yesterday they were your companion in laughter, dancing, and late-night gossip about who misinterpreted the king's mood that afternoon. But if that same person was executed for treason today, your emotions had to be rewritten as quickly as Henry rewrote history. Tears suggested loyalty to a traitor. Sympathy suggested complicity. Silence suggested inner turmoil, which could mean anything from guilt to plotting. So you had to mourn without mourning. You straightened your posture. You smoothed your expression into polite neutrality. You spoke of the condemned with vague, sanitized phrasing. It is unfortunate, but necessary. You acknowledged the death without allowing emotion to touch your voice. The court watched you, analysing every blink. If the king disliked the deceased, you mourned lightly. If the king respected the deceased, you mourned visibly, but elegantly, not too loudly, not too long, not too personally. If the king was undecided, you mourned cautiously, letting your grief hover in a safe middle ground, respectful but not intimate. The irony was painful. The more someone meant to you, the more carefully you had to act. Real sorrow risked exposure. The safest tears were theatrical ones, deployed strategically, like actors performing tragedy for an exacting director. Even family grief followed royal rules. If a loved one died while you were at court, you couldn't simply leave to comfort your household or attend the funeral. You needed permission to depart, and Henry VIII was not known for generosity when it came to letting people leave his orbit. He feared what unattended courtiers might plot, think, or whisper beyond palace walls. You might wait days or weeks for approval, practicing your most composed mourning face, while panic hollowed out your insides. And if the deceased had been under suspicion, even mild suspicion, Henry might deny your request altogether. You were expected to stay at court, resume service, and perform calm dignity, all while mourning someone you loved from a distance. Your grief, like everything else in the Tudor world, obeyed the king's convenience. Public funerals were the greatest test. If the court held a ceremony, it doubled as a political pageant. Your clothing had to reflect the correct level of sorrow. Dark enough to signal respect, but not so elaborate that you seemed overly attached. Your expression had to be solemn, but not devastated. Your presence near or far from the grieving family was calculated. Even the angle of your bow or curtsy suggested how deeply you felt the loss, and whether that depth aligned with royal expectations. Court musicians played mournful tunes, but the atmosphere was not one of raw emotion. It was tightly structured, choreographed grief. People cried prettily. They sighed meaningfully. They spoke in hushed tones that conveyed reverence rather than heartbreak. It was a performance of loss, not the lived reality of it. and beneath it all was the fear that if you cried too earnestly, someone would accuse you of caring too much about someone the king no longer approved of. The most tragic grief belonged to the families of those executed by royal order. These families were trapped in emotional paralysis. Mourned too openly and you looked treasonous. Mourned too quietly and you looked cold or guilty. Sometimes they weren't allowed public mourning at all. Their sorrow disappeared into silence, not because they felt less, but because Henry left no safe place to express it. Women of the court suffered particularly. As ladies in waiting, their expressions were scrutinized constantly. A single misplaced tear could ruin them. If a queen fell, like Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, or others disgraced by politics and royal wrath, the women who served her had to erase their affection overnight. One evening they might comfort their queen, hold her hands and whisper prayers. The next morning they had to maintain blank faces while the court discussed the queen's crimes. Their personal heartbreak became a lethal liability. Men fared no better. If their mentor or patron died, they could not show despair. Their careers depended on quickly reassociating themselves with the next rising power. Loyalty did not endear, it endangered. A tear shed in private could become a rumour in public. A rumour became evidence, evidence became peril. Even Henry's own grief was politicised. When Jane Seymour died, the court had to mourn deeply, but not more deeply than Henry. When Catherine of Aragon died, the court had to mourn politely, but not too sincerely. When Anne Boleyn died, the court had to mourn nothing at all. Imagine living in a world where not only your words, but your tears were regulated, where the muscles of your face had to obey royal law, where grief itself became a labyrinth of etiquette, where your sadness needed permission. In Henry VIII's England, tears were never private. They were statements, risks, weapons, evidence, the good news. You could grieve as long as your grief matched the king's expectations. The bad news, if it didn't, your tears might be the last honest thing you ever expressed. If you have ever had a moment where your face betrayed you, perhaps an involuntary eye roll in a meeting or a smirk you regretted, imagine that same moment happening in Henry VIII's court. Now imagine that moment being interpreted not as irritation or humour, but as treason. Under Henry, your face wasn't simply a face. It was a political document, a legal testimony, a battlefield, and a potential death sentence. Your expression could elevate you, expose you, or quietly erase you. At court, you lived in a world where everyone watched your face because the king watched everyone's face. Your eyebrows were ambassadors. Your smile was an oath. Your frown was a confession. In this environment, emotional neutrality wasn't just a skill, it was a survival art. Courtiers learned to hold polite expression so rigidly that marble statues envied their self-control. The danger began with Henry's temperament. As a king who believed that the universe revolved around him, and who occasionally acted as though he had personally installed the sun, Henry expected everyone's face to reflect his own feelings. If he was pleased, your face needed to radiate enthusiasm. If he was contemplative, your face needed to glow with philosophical curiosity. If he was angry, your face needed to display supportive indignation. The one expression you could never show was your actual emotion. Facial expressions were political signals. A delayed smile made you look hesitant. A too eager smile made you look insincere. A blank expression made you look calculating. A downward glance made you look guilty. A raised eyebrow made you look judgmental. A twitch near the mouth might be interpreted as private amusement at the king's expense. And in a court where humour, politics, religion, law, marriage, and personal loyalty had already become survival minefields, your face simply added another layer of possible disaster. The privy chamber, the groom of the stool, the ladies-in-waiting, ambassadors, servants, rivals, and even the king's favourite hunting dogs all seemed capable of reading your expression. If you accidentally frowned while Henry discussed a policy, someone might interpret your frown as dissent. If you sighed at an inconvenient moment, someone might say you were questioning the king's judgment. Even yawns were suspicious, as though boredom could be reinterpreted as political dissatisfaction. Court rivalries thrived in this climate. Enemies watched your face with predatory interest, waiting for a moment of unguarded emotion. A tiny grimace during one of Henry's jokes could be twisted into proof that you lacked devotion. A sympathetic glance towards someone falling from favour could be weaponized as evidence of secret loyalty. And at Henry's court, evidence didn't have to be true, it only had to be convincing. The right whisper, combined with the memory of your unfortunate expression, could turn a harmless muscle movement into a courtroom argument. Foreign ambassadors made the situation even worse. They were trained observers, skilled at detecting tension, alliances, and favouritism through body language. Their presence forced courtiers to maintain expressions even more carefully. If an ambassador noticed you looking anxious, he might interpret it as political instability. If he noticed you looking pleased at bad news, he might assume England was divided. Henry, who read ambassadorial letters with obsessive interest, was not amused by unintentional diplomatic eyebrow statements. Particularly dangerous were moments when Henry himself looked at you directly. His gaze felt like a command to freeze time. Your face had to instantly broadcast respect, loyalty, admiration, and absolute agreement, but without appearing overly desperate. Many courtiers mastered the expression known unofficially as the Tudor mask. Serene, deferential, mildly glowing with appreciation, but not so glowing that you looked sycophantic. Anything stronger invited suspicion. But the hardest expressions to control were those that appeared during crisis moments. If the king shouted, you needed to look appropriately alarmed but not terrified. If the king announced an execution, you needed to look serious but not sentimental. If the king wept, and he occasionally did, you needed to look compassionately moved but never distressed enough to imply his vulnerability troubled you. The worst scenario occurred when someone close to you fell from favour. At that moment, your face became a battlefield between grief and survival. One glance of sympathy toward the condemned could mark you for questioning. One expression of fear could mark you as an accomplice. One moment of hesitation could mark you as uncertain, and uncertainty was Henry VIII's least favourite personality trait in others. The stakes were highest during royal ceremonies and council meetings. Those settings were emotional chessboards, with Henry observing every move. At a feast, a misplaced smile might be read as mocking. At a sermon, a wandering gaze could be read as spiritual rebellion. At a diplomatic gathering, an unguarded look of confusion might be interpreted as dislike for Henry's policies or embarrassment about England, both dangerous in different ways. Even private moments weren't safe. Servants reported what they saw. Guards observed silently. Lady companions of queens became unwilling narrators of facial drama. She looked troubled. He seemed uneasy. Her expression was hopeful. His eyes suggested doubt. And under Henry, doubt was the most treacherous expression of all. But the true torment of facial surveillance lay in its absurd impossibility. Humans naturally react. You flinch at loud noises. You frown when concentrating. You look perplexed when confused. Yet these involuntary movements could become evidence of your inner thoughts. Thoughts which, according to Henry's logic, must be treasonous if he had not personally authorized them. And so courtiers practiced. They rehearsed in mirrors. They learned to freeze smiles, soften gazes, widen eyes at appropriate moments, and maintain a perfect poker face during emotional turmoil. Their faces became diplomatic tools, smooth, impenetrable, and exhausting to maintain. Some probably went to bed with sore cheeks from holding political expressions all day. The tragedy was that this emotional containment didn't just distort public behaviour, it distorted private identity. By the end of Henry's reign, many courtiers no longer knew what their real expressions looked like. They had performed loyalty so often their features had learned to obey before their minds even caught up. The good news, you could technically express yourself freely, as long as your expression matched the king's expectations. The bad news, a blink, a twitch, or a micro-smile could send you to the tower. In Henry VIII's court, the past was not a collection of memories, it was an arsenal meticulously catalogued, polished, and stored for future detonation. Every mistake you made, every careless word you spoke, every friendship you pursued, every gesture a rival disliked, all of it lived on, quietly, patiently, like a trapdoor under your feet. Years could pass. Kings could change wives, ministers, religions, and policies. But the one thing that never changed was this. The Tudor court remembered everything, and it remembered with purpose. Forgetfulness was a luxury reserved for peasants and poets. At court, remembering was strategy, forgetting was foolishness, and being remembered, incorrectly or accurately, could destroy you. The danger began with the simple fact that the Tudor court was small, tightly knit, and perpetually bored. Courtiers lived on gossip the way bees lived on pollen. They collected stories, stored them, repeated them, embellished them, and resold them later as political currency. Nothing disappeared, nothing faded, nothing stayed harmless. A joke you made 6 years ago could reappear at exactly the wrong moment, reshaped into evidence of arrogance. A disagreement you had over dinner could become proof of a long-standing feud. A minor error during a ceremony might one day be reframed as calculated disrespect. People at court remembered because remembering was profitable. The downfall of others opened positions, marriages, lands, and influence. A well-timed reminder of someone else's past mistake could push them just far enough down the ladder for you to climb. Rivals rarely confronted each other directly. They simply waited for the right moment to resurrect a forgotten misstep and present it to the king as fresh concern. And Henry VIII, with his shifting moods and appetite for certainty, loved being presented with memories that justified his suspicions. He trusted old stories more than new promises. If someone reminded him of a courtier's past mistake, especially one Henry had been angry about, that tiny spark could reignite into full suspicion. What Henry forgot, others resupplied. What he remembered, others weaponized. This meant that you couldn't outrun your past. You could apologize for a mistake, correct it, and dedicate years to proving yourself anew. It didn't matter. The court archived errors like relics. A mistake forgiven was not a mistake erased. It was simply a mistake waiting for new political relevance. Even success could haunt you. If you once achieved something extraordinary, rivals remembered it as ambition. If you once spoke boldly in a council meeting, rivals remembered it as dangerous assertiveness. If you once impressed the king, rivals remembered it as a threat to proper hierarchy, and they did not forget. Some courtiers developed the survival strategy of deliberate blandness. They kept their opinions mild, their gestures modest, their alliances quiet. They lived like shadows, present, useful, and unremarkable. It was the safest way to ensure no one remembered anything dramatic about you, because drama in Henry's court had a longer lifespan than most marriages. But even blandness wasn't a guarantee. Sometimes the court remembered things you had never done. A rumour whispered once could return in mutated form years later. Lies had endurance. Half-truths stretched into full accusations. Forget trying to defend yourself with, "But that happened a decade ago." At court, the correct response was, "A decade ago is practically yesterday," followed by suspicious tone. The most dangerous memories were those connected to former favourites. If you had been close to a person who later fell from favour, a queen, a minister, a noble, your past association became glowing radioactive evidence. You could protest that your friendship had been innocent. You could insist that you had drifted apart. None of it mattered. The court remembered you beside that person once, and Henry, persuaded by whispers, might decide you had shared their crimes, even if you shared nothing but a conversation about weather. The court also kept emotional memories. If the king ever felt embarrassed, challenged, or ignored by you, even briefly, that feeling lingered. Years later, he might not recall why he distrusted you, only that he did. And someone would always be ready to remind him, offering old stories wrapped in fresh interpretations. A frown Henry noticed in 1532 could become the reason you were arrested in 1538, with the help of a rival eager to revive ancient grievances. Even your youthful mistakes were fair game. Did you once mishandle a ceremonial duty as a teenager? Did you once laugh at the wrong moment during a feast? Did you once choose the wrong faction during a minor disagreement? Excellent. The court had filed those moments away under useful later. Nothing was too small, nothing was irrelevant. The court was like a living memory palace with a nasty sense of humour. And the king himself participated in this selective remembering. Henry loved loyalty but had a complicated relationship with gratitude. He remembered slights more vividly than service, insults more clearly than favours. Courtiers joked quietly, when far from listening ears, that Henry's forgiveness had an expiration date shorter than milk. His grudges, however, were preserved like ancient relics. If Henry believed someone had once doubted him, he carried that suspicion the way others carried pocket knives, small, handy, and occasionally lethal. The tragedy of this system was that change became nearly impossible. A courtier who matured couldn't escape their reckless youth. A courtier who reformed couldn't outrun their earlier reputation. A courtier who switched factions couldn't shed their previous alliances. Ghosts of the past followed everyone, whispering in the ears of the powerful. Even friendships suffered. People hesitated to form bonds because every bond created memories, and memories created vulnerabilities. Intimacy meant shared secrets, and shared secrets meant ammunition. Many courtiers lived in a state of constant emotional defence, terrified that something said in casual trust years ago would resurface with sharpened edges. The court didn't merely remember actions, it remembered interpretations, it remembered feelings, it remembered suggestions, and once something became part of its collective memory, accurate or not, it became part of your political fate. The good news? If you never made a single mistake, you were safe. The bad news? In Henry VIII's court, breathing counted as a mistake. After hours of rules so arbitrary, stressful, and emotionally acrobatic that modern therapists would faint just reading them, one question finally emerges. Why? Why did Henry VIII build a court where humour was dangerous, silence was suspicious, clothing was regulated, grief was monitored, gifts were weaponized, memories were sharpened, and reality changed without warning? Why did he create a system that demanded constant vigilance from everyone around him and turned daily life into a careful dance on a floor made of fragile egos and sharpened laws? The answer is both simple and terrifying. For Henry VIII, these rules made perfect sense. To understand them, you have to understand Henry not as the caricature of a tyrant, but as the product of his upbringing, pressures, anxieties, insecurities, ambitions, and the heavy Tudor crown he carried from age 17. Henry was not born paranoid, but he was born into a world where kings died violently, where rebellions simmered constantly, where foreign threats loomed endlessly, and where the dynasty he inherited was only one generation old. His father, Henry VII, survived a civil war by treating suspicion as oxygen, and he taught his son that a careless king was a dead one. From the start, Henry learnt that trust was dangerous, loyalty was fragile, and power required performance. But he also learned that a king who seemed weak invited challenge. Thus, Henry VIII grew into a monarch who believed that to survive he had to appear invincible, and to appear invincible he had to control everything: behaviour, emotion, law, friendship, love, religion, history, and even the expressions on other people's faces. His rules weren't random, they were tools. Fear was his first tool. Fear was efficient, fast, reliable. It kept courtiers alert, obedient, and deeply invested in pleasing him. When people feared making a wrong move, they made fewer moves, and Henry preferred a court where he dictated the choreography. Ritual was his second tool. Ceremony created order, hierarchy, predictability. At least for him, if everyone bowed the same way, laughed at the right moment, wore the right fabrics, and followed the correct dining protocols, the order reassured Henry that he was in control. Ritual made his world feel stable, even when his body, marriages, and politics were not. Unpredictability was his third and most powerful tool. A predictable monarch can be manipulated. A predictable system can be gamed. But Henry's unpredictability meant no one could form alliances against him with confidence. Every morning at court was a question. Which version of the king would arrive today? The charming scholar, the jovial hunter, the wrathful judge, the melancholic philosopher, the paranoid tyrant. When the king's moods were weather patterns, courtiers learned to stay inside, politically speaking. Paranoia, though destructive, also made sense to Henry. He lived through betrayals, rebellions, spies, foreign plots, domestic uprisings, and the constant threat of being replaced by someone more legitimate. He saw conspiracies everywhere because, frankly, some did exist. When your crown sits on a throne built after decades of civil war, you don't assume stability. You assume instability and fight it with everything you have. These rules also reinforced Henry's identity as a monarch whose authority came from God. If people feared him, obeyed him, mirrored him, performed for him, and rearranged their memories for him, it affirmed a truth Henry desperately needed to believe. He was the centre of the universe. His whims were divine will. His anger was cosmic justice. His desires were national policy. His insecurities were state secrets. The court reflected this belief back at him every day. When courtiers laughed at his jokes, adjusted their meals to match his, revised their grief to please him, or rewrote history on command, Henry saw confirmation that his rule was absolute. The rituals became a mirror that never let him see doubt, only divorce. But beneath that mirror was a fragile human truth Henry didn't acknowledge. All this control was exhausting for him too. Maintaining a world where everyone obeyed, performed and feared required constant vigilance. Henry's paranoia shaped his court, but the court also shaped his paranoia. Every rule tightened his control while tightening his anxiety. Every display of loyalty fed his need for more. Every betrayal, real or imagined, justified harsher demands. It was a cycle no one could escape, not even the king. For courtiers, these rules created the most emotionally draining workplace in European history. You didn't just work for Henry VIII, you survived him. You woke up every day prepared to adjust your personality, opinions, posture, memories, and facial expressions to ensure the king had no reason to dislike you. You became a living instrument of royal psychology, tuned carefully to avoid discord. It made sense to Henry because chaos terrified him. It made sense to Henry because power thrilled him. It made sense to Henry because control reassured him. It made sense to Henry because unpredictability protected him. And so, in his mind, the court wasn't oppressive, it was necessary. A kingdom held together by ritual, fear, loyalty, performance, and constantly shifting truths was, to Henry, a kingdom where no one could betray him without being seen. To everyone else, however, it was a masterpiece of psychological strain, emotional contortion, and political suffocation, a place where humanity bent itself into knots just to make it through the day. The good news, you survived Henry VIII's court. The bad news, after living under these rules, you're now permanently allergic to eye contact, laughter, writing, gifts, travel, emotions, conversations, fabrics, history, and, most of all, kings.